Day by day, we realize how flawed our human species is. We here at Jeff Incorporated therefore have developed a solution for one of the most pressing concerns of the human race. We are at an age where everyone has to have an opinion. If you don't have an opinion on something, how will you get into unnecessary arguments over the internet with stupid strangers that you don't know? And that's where we present our solution. This video. One of the most important things to have an opinion on these days are bosses in From Software games.
Shit game. That did not hit me.
Be it Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, or even Dark Souls 2 if you really have to. But those days are gone. You never again have to make up your own opinion about these bosses. Because now you can just copy the opinion that's presented in this video and you will be 100% right in every single one of them.
Fucking shit game. One of the worst games I've ever played.
And all this for no subscription. All you need to do is waste like 5 hours of your time watching this video. So strap yourselves in, grab a block of cheese from the fridge and enjoy. To be more precise, this video will encompass Demon's Souls, the Dark Souls trilogy, Bloodborne, Sekiro and Elden Ring. This video will present a complete ranking of all the bosses. However, if you prefer a tier list, I've also graded them from S to F, with a plus and minus added if you prefer even more tiers, because higher number better person. Or if you've become accustomed to Steam, where the only two options you have is to either recommend something or not recommend something, and there's no option in between, everything is black and white, then you can just go that C to S are good bosses and E and F are bad bosses. Sound good? Great, let's get going, because this video is gonna be long enough without a half-an-hour intro. First game in the pipeline is Demon's Souls, the fourth game I played after the Dark Souls trilogy. Most of the footage from this section will not be from me, because I'm a student, meaning I'm broke, meaning I don't have a PS5. I don't even have a PS3. The only way I had to play the game was emulating the old version on the PC. But let's not kid ourselves, the remake looks fucking amazing, so I'll be using footage from that, mostly. I did 2 playthroughs of this game, the first one I actually streamed, you can find the footage on my YouTube channel, where I went for a faith build. In the beginning I went for a halberd, which I started out with, and in the later game I used the Moonlight Greatsword. In my second playthrough, which I did privately offline, I went for a strength build, where I first used the meat cleaver and then the Dragonbone Smasher. Both my playthroughs I ended at exactly level 66 and I didn't use a single summon. With all that out of the way, let's begin. Starting us off in Demon's Souls is the Vanguard Demon, and honestly, what better way to start us off than someone who looks like he frequents McDonald's and whose entire job is to sit on you? That's right, this is the school bully that ended up getting a better job than whatever you and I are doing. And to be fair, that is a job he does fairly well. And that's, well, kind of all he does. He's supposed to be intimidating, but also really fucking easy. I mean, he has 3 attacks. The only thing that makes him even remotely difficult is his really high health pool. This is a trend that we're gonna see a lot. The first boss isn't supposed to be mechanically interesting, he's just supposed to be intimidating and show you your new home, the You Died screen. Once you're finished getting your ass kicked by that fat ass and have met everyone's favorite goth waifu,
touch the demon inside me.
You're introduced to Boletaria. 1-1, the first section of Boletaria, is actually really fucking cool, honestly. The initial view of the castle with the dragon flying overhead is pretty damn cool, then you fight your way across the ramparts, getting introduced to the Souls level design. Can't forget rolling that boulder down that alleyway, that's the best part of it. And then when you pull the lever to open the boss door, you get this cutscene. And while your pause champs and hypers start spinning out of control while you get closer to the gate, what ends up greeting you inside is a bunch of blobs around a bigger blob. I'm of the opinion that the first section past the tutorial should be the one to get you hooked into the game. It doesn't always have to be the first, but ideally you want it to be. Because the longer you take really convincing the player that this is the shit, the more players you're gonna leave behind on the way there. And while 1-1 delivered, the boss does not. I mean, you just lob a couple firebombs in there and you're practically done. And while you can make the argument that that at least rewards exploration, even when you don't explore or don't get any firebombs, I mean the boss and blob combined have as many attacks as Vanguard, and in some ways are less interesting than him. This just ends up being a massive waste of a really cool cutscene. Thankfully, after that disaster we get the Tower Knight, who is basically the poster child of Demon Souls. This absolute unit of a boss who you would not want to do a dick measuring contest with is undoubtedly the first thing that can be called a highlight of Demon Souls. Fighting against giant bosses like this is a classic video game trope, but honestly not one that will ever get old, so undoubtedly this is a great fight from a spectacle standpoint. One glaring issue with this boss fight, however, is the gimmick of the archers on the ramparts, who you basically have to kill if you don't want to get peppered by arrows from the side constantly. That by itself wouldn't be too bad, but you're completely safe from the Tower Knight as the railing is high enough to shield you from his only ranged attacks. So the beginning of each fight just ends up being a chore where you get rid of the archers one by one while being exposed to no danger. The actual battle against the Tower Knight is quite good, however considering that getting rid of the archers is half the fight, that does sadly put a dent in things. If this was a competition about which boss name would have made 13-year-old me laugh the most, this is an easy first. In fact, I would say I still have the humor of a 13-year-old, since the only thing I can think of is why isn't there a boss fight that's 2 penetrators, one on each side? Teenage delusions aside, this is actually quite a decent boss. I mean, he's quite basic from today's perspective, but he still plays well, and I think it's just that he was a blueprint for some following bosses, and that's why he seems basic from today's perspective. His obvious main asset is his long range with his long stick. Sorry. And it's just one of those fights that when you have it down, it feels quite good. That one actually wasn't intended, believe it or not. Let's just move on before this gets out of hand, shall we? Taking a quick departure from our fantasy setting into something straight out of science fiction, we have a robot spider, because why the fuck not? This is one where you're mainly just fighting the arena, as most of the fight boils down to running down the small corridor, while the spider throws webs and fireballs at you, and then when you're there she uses like 2 attacks, you hit her a couple times before you have to run away when she does the explosion attack. Or if you're just stupid like me, you don't run away from the explosion and just heal through it. And so while mechanically this fight isn't really much better than a bunch of blobs around a bigger blob, at least it's a fucking robot spider. Flame Lurker is undoubtedly the hardest boss in Demon Souls, but because that's obviously not enough, FromSoft decided that to even get to him, you have to lose half your HP by jumping down that fucking pit. I wanna murder whoever did this. Even if, spoiler alert, Dark Souls 2 will end up being the king of terrible and agonizing boss runs, this one really gives that game a run for its money. The actual fight against the Flame Lurker, however, is the exact opposite and honestly stands as a hallmark of great boss design to this day. This is one of the most suffocating boss fights in the history of boss fights. This guy does not let you breathe. Not only that, but even the classic tactic of getting behind the boss doesn't give you any respite, because his backstabs make that not a viable tactic. This all means that you have to fight an aggressive explosion maniac head on. And if that wasn't enough, he gets hotter, faster and brighter the lower his HP is. He gets so bright that if you're playing the original Demon Souls, good fucking luck being able to tell what the fuck is even going on with him. If I played the original Demon Souls when it came out, I would have thought that this is one of those bosses they're gonna build upon in future releases. But no, they never really did that. And maybe that's because they realized that this one already kind of stands at the pinnacle of its kind. If you actually manage to beat the Vanguard Demon in the tutorial, you get greeted by this. That's right, you saw correctly. This is a giant fucking dragon that punches you. Now, if that's not an awesome concept, I don't know what is. The problem is, a concept is just a concept, and if all you pile onto that concept is shit, it's gonna be hard to find the good idea that's buried within all this shit. And that is what the Dragon God is. For whatever reason they decided to do a stealth boss in a game with basically no stealth mechanics. It's as if at the end of Hitman you had to fight Artorias. It doesn't matter that Artorias is a good boss, what the fuck is he doing here? If there were at least any sort of base to the mechanics, I could see it working out. But because there isn't, they have to make it super obvious when the Dragon God isn't looking at you, so it just becomes red light, green light. I tried to give a lot of Demon Souls bosses some leeway, because they came first, and so some experimentation is nice in the beginning. But let's call a spade a spade. This is shit. There's nothing else you can call it. Well, okay, I lied. You can call it garbage, that works too. Moving on to Latria, the first boss we encounter here is the Fool's Idol. And this is a boss I've actually come around on, believe it or not. The atmosphere in this fight is actually great, and the visual design of the boss is fairly unique even across all the games. It also has some pretty unique mechanics that work fairly well, like the traps it sets, where it shows you some circles on the ground and you gotta keep in mind where they are, because they vanish in a couple of seconds. And this means, because I have a terrible memory, that I actually died to this boss, believe it or not, even on my second playthrough. You also have to kill the NPC that is controlling her outside of the arena, although that aspect of it ends up being more annoying than positive. Now, even with me being an idiot, this is still a fairly easy fight, and with that it will always lack some memorability. Another thing I don't like about this fight is the arena, where there's these benches where even if you destroy them, you still can't walk over them, which is just ridiculous. I mean, look at this. But all in all, considering I'm a fool, she's honestly not too bad of an idol. As you'll get to know over the course of this video, I'm not the biggest fan of double bosses. What can I say? I mean, I'm just more of a vanilla guy, I don't like threesomes very much. However, what's even weirder somehow is a shifted threesome, where the third guy comes in after the first two are done and one of them leaves. Now, pardon my innocence, as I don't really know if that's even a thing, but that is what the man-eaters are. The second man-eater only comes when the first one is practically dead. Why not just give the first one double the health bar? Weird, or let's say less common kinks aside, one thing that is also not really a turn on for me is how janky they are. They have a charge move that often makes them end up in the air, which sounds cool on paper, but the execution needs some work. And honestly, aside from their jankiness and their aversion to work together, there's really not much to discuss here. It's a fairly bland boss. Now, take this one with a grain of salt, as I obviously couldn't really try the PvP aspect of it, so I'm also gonna keep it really short. The NPC they put in place of it sucks. That's about it. That's not the point of this fight, so let's just move on. You know, there's actually a lot of redeeming qualities about the Adjudicator boss. For one, there's a bird on top of his head, which is the actual boss. And then there's his long tongue, which makes him incredibly good at certain things, I'm sure. And also, well, okay, I can't do this anymore. I just don't have much to say about this boss. He's just incredibly boring. I mean, you hit the wound a couple of times, he barely hits back, you don't even need to dodge. You bash the bird, and then you do that a couple times. I mean, if you play him ranged, he's easier than most normal enemies. It's incredible that that's even possible. He's just a big pile of nothing. What do you want me to say? Remember what I said about the Dragon God and a stealth boss in a non-stealth game not being the play? Well, I failed to mention that I'm a fucking liar, since this boss is actually really fucking cool. The difference here being that it doesn't throw the entire game mechanics out of the window in favor of a press here to win button. You actually still have to play the game. Imagine that. Completely new concept. Especially when you play him without a Thief's Ring. This one is tense as fuck and a really unique experience in the entire franchise. Now, first off, I will mention that the remastered version of this fight is fucking sick. The remaster by itself looks absurdly good, but they really outdid themselves with this one. It looks amazing. Now, with that out of the way, this is what it looks like in the original. It's not the same. Obviously the gameplay isn't gonna carry a fight where the boss has one singular attack, but there really isn't any atmosphere in the original. And again, that's the version I'm rating. So, based on that, I can only give it a D-. Honestly, we all know this boss is extremely unmemorable. So instead let's talk about the mechanic where the items in the arena are actually dynamic. So if you've ever watched someone else play, you might notice a weirdly different distribution of items. The amount of them is actually correlated to the depraved ones that fall down in 5.1, whether it's alive or as ragdolls. That's a really cool mechanic. Thanks, Illusory Wall. Does that save the boss now? No. It's a pile of leeches with like 3 attacks that most likely goes down after 10 hits. It's a pile of garbage. They put armor on the leechmonger and called it a different boss. Oh wait, it's flies now instead of leeches. My bad. Obviously it's S tier. No, seriously, what the fuck is this? I mean, right after the leechmonger you served this thing? The only redeeming thing about the leechmonger was the item mechanic, and that's missing. Do literally anything else, please.
And now for something completely different.
Thankfully, it does seem that FromSoft did hear my plea and didn't put in the leechmonger a third time, but this time he's wearing high heels. But instead we get something that's very, very different. Maiden Astrea doesn't only prove that Demon's Souls is a prequel to Elden Ring.
Unfortunately for you, however, you are maidenless.
But is also a fairly successful attempt at making a non-boss boss. The only thing you're actually fighting here is her bodyguard, which is basically an easy NPC fight, but that is not what this is about. The Valley of Defilement is aptly named because it is a wretched place. And while going through it you come across, for example, this merchant woman who blames a lot of the bad stuff that's happening here on Maiden Astrea. What you end up finding though is someone who gave up being a human and became an archdemon to help people. Someone who risked making an enemy out of the entire world just to help the people in the Valley of Defilement. The purpose of this boss is to make you think,
Are we the baddies?
and while I do think that suffers a bit from the vague and subtle storytelling that Demon's Souls employs, for example on my first playthrough I didn't make all the connections so it wasn't as impactful as it could have been, it still ends up being a very successful and unique moment in the game. No matter how you look at it, Boletaria is the main area of Demon's Souls. It is the only area with 4 bosses, and the last one I saved for last, because it's the closest Demon's Souls has to a final boss. At the top of an elevator you'll find Colonel Sanders trying to sell you chicken wings, and with a very aggressive attitude, mind you. This is not a bad boss by any means, however, it all comes back to how well the boss does the job it's assigned. He does have a very varied moveset, but it doesn't feel very cohesive at the same time. He has some random gimmicks thrown in there, like his grab that lowers your level, which is kinda weird. I don't quite get the point of that, honestly. And also in the original some of his animations are very strange, especially his sliding animation. Another issue arises due to the fact that healing items in Demon's Souls are consumables, and this is the final boss, right at the end of Boletaria, where you'll find the most healing items. You'll likely just be able to heal your way through that fight, you are not forced in any way to actually learn the fight. Due to that, Old King Alland ends up as one of the bosses I've died the least amount to in Demon's Souls. And while Demon's Souls is on the easier side, it's still supposed to be a difficult game, and as a final boss that means he's just kinda lacking. While Demon's Souls isn't a terrible game in terms of bosses, I think the areas are a bigger highlight here, with Boletaria, Latria and parts of the Valley of Defilement being quite good, but FromSoft would, when it comes to the bosses in the further games, just take what worked here and expand on it and refine it further. And that's exactly where we'll get to next, because the next game is Dark Souls 1. This was the first of these games that I played, and it took me a bunch of attempts to actually get started. I did 3 full playthroughs of Dark Souls 1. In the first one I focused on strength and ended the game with a Man-Serpent Greatsword, though I used a bunch of different weapons like spears and halberds throughout. In my second playthrough I basically leveled only endurance and vitality and used a Zweihander, while in my third playthrough I focused on dexterity and used the Uchi Katana pretty much for the entire playthrough. I also again didn't use really any summons in any of the runs. Also again, much of the footage will not be from me because I only have the Prepare to Die edition, not the remastered version. So with that out of the way, let's get started. As I said, Dark Souls 1 was my first FromSoft game, but actually I got really into FromSoft games in 2020 with Dark Souls 1, but I first played the game like 5 years earlier. And there are a couple reasons why it took so long for me to get into it. The Asylum Demon is one of those reasons, but not in the way you think. If I remember correctly, then I only died to the Asylum Demon once, and that was actually in my first run that I finished and put on YouTube, and that was mutual destruction. So no, it wasn't the difficulty, quite the opposite. It was the cunts in my friend list that after I told them that I tried Dark Souls and decided it wasn't for me, went, "Oh, so you never finished Dark Souls, but like Skyrim, so you must have never gotten past the Asylum Demon and called it quits. Get good."
That's nice. What does it say?
So yeah, it was nothing that actually had anything to do with the boss. I genuinely think the Souls community might be the most unwelcoming video game community to new players out there, and it's really sad. But let's get back on track. The Asylum Demon is an upgraded Vanguard in some sense, and it's okay. However, despite being a better fight than Vanguard, I think it's worse, because this is a fight you actually have to fight. The Vanguard fight isn't one you're supposed to finish. So due to that, the Vanguard fight not being that fun to actually fight isn't that detrimental. Here it sadly is. Honestly, on my first playthrough, the guy with a shield next door was more fun and more difficult than the Asylum Demon. But it does its job as a teaching tool, so honestly you can't call it a bad boss. And here we come to another reason why I took so long to get into Souls. Oh hey, you got past the tutorial where the boss was a big guy with a club, and got past the fuckers throwing fire, barrels, arrows and themselves at you. Here's your reward. A big demon guy with a club, but totally different cause he's a goat. Okay, listen, I know he's not a carbon copy, but take it from the view of a player who has only seen these two bosses and is not familiar with Souls or third-person games for that matter. They are similar. They even have the same gimmick with killing them from above. This one is even worse, since instead of doing that once you can do it like 3 times and he's done. The arena is a cool idea, but at the same time, for a beginning player, fighting in that small confined space where you have no space to really roll is really fucking annoying at the same time, and really pushes you into doing the gimmick, jump down and kill him. The first boss past the tutorial is where the game should actually show you what it has to offer, and not do the same thing again but slightly different. For years this was the final boss I beat in Dark Souls, and to this day I still don't think it was a good idea to include this boss this early on. So after the Taurus Demon did a perfect job in reaffirming my thoughts that Dark Souls was a shit game, I was in peak complainer mode. I was looking under every nook and cranny for something to complain about. That stone is placed wrong, that enemy should be slightly to the left, and most importantly, why are there no anime girls in a game from Japan? What the fuck is going on here? And then I arrived at the Undead Parish and the Bell Gargoyles, and suddenly my world was utterly shattered. I mean, the peak complainer mindset I thought I had, that was unbeatable in the world, was struggling. Well, I mean, one thing was obvious, the boss run is terrible, but let's leave that aside. Everything else worked. And sure, you can make the argument that the Bell Gargoyles are again demon-looking guys with big weapons, but they are different enough visually, and most importantly, they play completely different. This was the first time I was challenged in Souls. This was the first time I had to learn something the hard way in Souls. Not only is the arena awesome, and the appearance of the second gargoyle will make your heart sink into your stomach.
Oh, cool. Now that's not good.
But they're perfectly made for a duo boss fight, especially early on. You have a lot of space in the arena, and they have a lot of range. That makes the fight all about spacing. Well, unless you can two-shot them, but on your first playthrough you'll not be able to two-shot them. It also was a great idea to make the second one more focused on the firebird attacks, because it makes the fight a lot more strategic. Who do you go for and how do you isolate the right one? All in all, my only real complaint about the bell gargoyles is that they should have come sooner, cause then I would have gotten into Souls years earlier. Can you believe that in like 4 different playthroughs I stopped right before the bell gargoyles? And after I finally beat them, I managed to beat the entire game in a matter of days. So yeah, this is the first near flawless boss. After I finally got my first great moment of Dark Souls with the Undead Parish and the Bell Gargoyles, being the gamer that I was, obviously I went off in the entirely wrong direction, and the next boss I encountered was the Moonlight Butterfly. When I first saw this boss, I was unreasonably excited. It was something completely different from all the bosses previously, and I thought it floating down when you start the fight looked really fucking cool. However, what you actually end up with is a Pokemon battle. I mean, really, if you don't play ranged, what you do is you dodge the 2 attacks that it has, and then it comes down, then you hit it a couple of times, and then it goes off again. That is the entire fight. I know Pokemon also comes from Japan, but that really wasn't the right place to take inspiration from. Venturing further off the main path, my next boss was obviously the Great Grey Wolf, Sif. And there's only 2 ways I can talk about this boss. Either I'm gonna rant for half an hour or I'm gonna keep it very short. So I'm gonna try to do the latter. The arena is nice, the intro cutscene is great. The Easter egg when you first rescue him in the DLC and then fight him is amazing. Even going back after all the other games, this fight still plays well. Fighting under him brings out a David vs Goliath feel that honestly not even the dragon bosses of the future games have managed to replicate. His design is absolutely iconic. It was one of the few things that I had seen before even playing Dark Souls the first time. And then there's the limping when he gets to low HP and the lore behind it.
Oh. Damn. That is sick though. Oh damn. That is so well done. I am really impressed.
The Bell Gargoyles were near flawless, but this is a masterpiece. The only negative point I can really say is that when you don't fight him when you're this new to Dark Souls or just later in the game, the fight loses some of the intensity it had, which amplified some of the other aspects of the fight as well. However, my first encounter with this boss was absolutely incredible.
That was a sick boss. I love that. This is what I want from Dark Souls. Can I get only this? If I get only this, I'll be so happy with this game. Damn, that was great. That was just all around great. I wish I got the sword though.
And going back after all the other games, I didn't think it would hold up. But it does. It absolutely fucking does. You gotta give some credit to From Software here, as they caught themselves. I mean, they almost did another big demon guy with big weapon boss again, but thankfully they changed it into 2 dogs instead. It's incredibly telling that even though this boss took 2 attempts in my first playthrough, I was still fucking frustrated with it. I mean, if we're being real, the real fight is the fucking camera along with the dogs, and this fucker with 2 dildos doesn't save anything. They even included another plunging attack gimmick. I mean, at this point they gotta be meaning, right? Pinwheel is an infamous boss. Everybody knows Pinwheel. But the reason he's so well known is not because he's challenging, or because the fight is epic, or because he's a central figure in the game. No. Pinwheel is well known because of 2 reasons. For one, he drops the Mask of the Father, which is critical to one of the biggest memes in the Dark Souls community to date. And the second, and somehow even bigger reason is, he's a joke. It's funny because in general in Dark Souls there's a lack of mage bosses. So here we finally have one, and the fight consists of him multiplying and throwing the same fireball at you. The real kicker for me here is that he's called Pinwheel, because before you fight him you go through this valley full of these skeleton wheels, which in my opinion are maybe the most dangerous enemy in the entirety of Dark Souls 1. And honestly, if you plugged a bunch of them in a room for a boss, you could have called that boss Pinwheel too. and it would have been more challenging, let's be real. Aw, look at that boy. Who's a good boy? That looks cute. This is gonna be a cute boss. Huh. Right, yeah, no, totally. That's reasonable. I absolutely adore the opening cutscene, and because of that I really want to love the boss. But honestly, the presentation absolutely carries this fight. Gameplay wise, it's just a lot of hacking at its side without him really doing much about it. He has a very limited moveset that isn't very interesting, and the only thing the fight really has going for it is, like I said, the presentation. It's not totally awful gameplay wise, but honestly, if I call a fight good, the gameplay should at least be semi-decent, and here it's barely okay. While obviously FromSoft are from Japan, one collaboration I didn't expect, I'll have to be honest here, is the collaboration they had with Monster Musume for Chaos Witch Kralak. It's a strange combination for sure, but honestly I think it worked out fairly well. The obvious positive aspect of this boss is boobs, but the gameplay is also pretty neat. Similarly to the Bell Gargoyles, this one is a lot about spacing, because her most characteristic and pace-defining attack is her lava vomit, which stays for quite a while, and if you don't pay attention you can get backed off into a corner and it'll be really uncomfortable. She also has a nice mix of body and sword attacks, however there's one explosion attack that's very hard to recognize, and I don't love that. By this point we've exited the early game of Dark Souls, so I would have liked something a bit more sophisticated, but I mean, she's still a good boss, you can't really complain all too much. After getting through Takeshi's castle, what awaits you at the end is a sumo fight with a giant hunk of metal. This is one of those bosses that gets significantly less interesting the better you get at him. If you know what you're doing, you can just rush him down like toilet paper during COVID, optionally make him take a visit to the forest down below. However, when you don't know what you're doing, this guy is really fucking fun. This is one of those rare cases where a normally suboptimal arena works in the boss's favor. It's entirely designed around throwing you off. Even if by this point Dark Souls 1 already threw at you a myriad of different boss types, when I first played this game, I absolutely loved it, because it was so different from everything else that came before it. Sadly, this is an experience I can't ever really relive because I've gotten better at it, but that first time still holds a really special place in my heart. This is the part of the video where I'm just extremely thankful that no one will fucking watch this, because if anyone does, I'm gonna get murdered. People are gonna find out where I live and then they're gonna slit my throat, because the next boss is Ornstein and Small. Or is it Ornstein? I'm not sure, to be honest. Anna Londo is incredible, and the build up for this boss is insane, because you see the cathedral early on and you slowly work your way towards the boss room. Ornstein and Smo moveset wise are maybe the best duo boss ever. The slow Ornstein with his occasional charges and ranged attacks, and Smo with his unrelenting pursuit of you, complement each other perfectly, resulting in a constant barrage of attacks. However, thankfully the room gives you a couple dildos with which you can isolate them and slowly whittle them down. On my first playthrough I actually first tried them. However, it took like 30 minutes. It was not a pleasant experience, it felt very tedious. In subsequent playthroughs however, they have been one of, if not the hardest boss every time. Now, obviously Ornstein and Smo are universally loved in the community, and there's no doubt that they're an amazing boss. However, and this is the part I'm gonna get stabbed for, they do have a couple issues.
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
For one, the boss run is annoying. It's made much less bad by the skip you can do on the stairs. However, that's only a very minor point. The big reason, and the one that will make everyone mad, is I don't love the second phase. A common issue with a lot of these duo bosses is that once you beat one of the two, the fight becomes a joke. Even the Bear Gargoyles, an S-tier boss, has this issue. However, because when the duo part of that fight starts, both are at half health, no matter who you kill, the portion where you only fight one of them after having killed the other isn't a huge part of this fight. Ornstein and Smo tries to mitigate this issue by having the one who survived absorb the power of the other one and gain some new moves. But this is where it really shows that Ornstein and Smo by themselves aren't that amazing, but together they fill each other's gaps and create an amazing fight. The changes either of them undergoes when they go into the second phase aren't enough to make them a great boss by themselves. When I said that Ornstein and Smo has been the hardest boss for me past my first playthrough every time, that is exclusively the first phase. Not only have I never died once in the second phase, I've never even really struggled. The second phases are so simple, they feel like early game bosses when you don't know the game that well. This late into the game, I'm sorry, they're a joke. And normally this wouldn't be a huge issue, like I said in the Berger Girls fight, that part of the fight is very short. But not only do they regain some health, they also gain some moves that make the fight not really harder, but just longer, like Smo's AoE attacks. Just the first phase is an undeniable S-tier boss, but I'm sorry, I don't love the second part of this fight. When I first fought this chonker of a guy, I actually quite liked it. I mean, he does have a name that sounds like an STD, so that's one thing, but on the other hand its size is intimidating and the fight is tense. However, on my second playthrough, he literally only used one attack. On my third playthrough, he literally only used one attack. So now I have no choice other than to partially rate him on having one attack. Which really hurts because I think the presentation of this fight and some of the lore behind it is great. I don't even mind the gimmick ending of it, where he jumps off into the pit. It's not badly done, but my god, why does he sometimes only use one fucking attack? And next we have the Demon Fire stage, which is just the Asylum Demon, but he's on fire. The sad thing is, I actually like the idea of reusing early game bosses later on. It gives the whole world a sense of continuity. But especially considering the Asylum Demon wasn't a standard boss in the first place, you gotta do more than give it 2 new attacks and set it on fire. You just gotta.
Another one. Another
Oh,
one.
baby, it's triple! Oh, yeah!
Another one.
No more.
And another one.
Where the fuck are your parents? Who are your parents? I'm gonna call Child Protective Services. It's time to stop!
Technically, I guess the final boss of the Demon Ruins area is the Centipede Demon. This is a boss which is kind of a puzzle boss because the main difficulty of this fight is that 80% of the arena is lava and you have to figure out the one place where you can actually fight it in. Apart from that, it's super difficult to tell what is actually going on when you're fighting under him. I'm still not sure what moves it has. I guess it has a jump, bite, the stomp, I don't know. You can cut off some parts of it, so that's nice. My favorite thing about this is actually that you can see it hanging off the wall early on in the Demon Ruins. That's a really cool touch, I really like that. Other than that, this is just like most of the Demon Ruins. Really unremarkable. It's time for everyone's favorite thing about Dark Souls. Platforming! And because everyone loves it so much, we've decided to turn it into one of the major bosses of the game. Now don't get too excited just yet, because it gets even better. We've decided to put it in the worst area of the game, with lava that burns your eyes, dragon butts and toilet demons. Now I know I've got everyone's attention, so I can tell you something more. When you enter the room, you'll be greeted by a really sick visual boss design. But that boss isn't gonna do much of anything. No, this is a platforming boss. The only thing he's gonna do is occasionally try to throw you into the void. Now the first thing you're gonna have to do is walk to one side of him and kill the thing that's there. What is it? You don't really care, let's be honest. Who gives a fuck about lore in Dark Souls, am I right? Or am I right? But now the real fun begins. The ground is gonna collapse in really unpredictable ways, so you're likely gonna fall directly into the void after doing that. It's fun for the entire family! And no, we haven't put a bonfire close to the boss room. No, you're gonna have to walk through the entire area That is the worst area in the entire game again. I honestly can't believe we came up with such a brilliant idea. When you get back to the boss room, you're not gonna have to do that again. So the entire boss just consists of you dying twice and then beating the boss with no real effort. Isn't that fun? This is the future of boss design, ladies and gentlemen. Now, after you do the same thing to the other side and obviously die again and have to run back all the way again, you're gonna jump down the middle and one-shot the boss. And what are we gonna call this masterpiece, you ask? Well, obviously the Bed of Chaos. Why the Bed of Chaos? Well, chaos, because obviously nothing makes sense here. And the bad part comes from the fact that after doing that, you're gonna rather go to bed than do anything remotely like that ever again in your life. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna have to run away, because else I'm gonna get stabbed by every single person that ever played this game. Thank you very much. I think Miyazaki needs a basic math course, because for a boss called 4 Kings, there's just more than 4. So you find these 7 kings at the bottom of Anolondo in a place called the Abyss, which is pretty dark. It's so dark it's just black, meaning you have absolutely no depth perception, but it does give the fight a nice atmosphere. The boss itself though could get another nickname besides 7 kings, and that is DPS kings, because that is what they are. They are just a giant DPS check. In all my runs they've been either stupidly easy or absolutely impossible. There's nothing in between. The movement is super basic, you barely need to dodge, you can just wail on them, but if you don't get one down before the second one spawns, you're fucked. I don't mind DPS checks in theory, but this one is too much. Everything else about this fight is pretty good, but past my first playthrough I've just been relieved to be through with it, rather than actually enjoying the fight. The best of the Lord Souls without a shred of a doubt ends up being Gravelord Nito. The worst part of the fight is actually the beginning, as you have to drop in and take a bunch of fall damage just to start the fight. But everything else about this fight is designed perfectly. The arena is a real clutch factor. The donut shape gives you room to kite the skeletons around and into Nito himself, whose attacks can just get rid of them for you, making this a really unique fight that plays extremely well. In addition to that, it's an audio based boss, where because of the donut shape sometimes you can't see him, but he has an attack where he thrusts his sword into the ground, which comes up below you, which has an audio cue that you need to react to. It's a really well designed addition to the fight that makes him dangerous even when you can't see him. So the gameplay in this fight is spot on. The visual design is spot on. What more could you even want? While I don't count the Dragon God as a dragon boss per se, Demon's Souls did have the red and blue dragon, which are just glorified obstacles that could be killed by putting like 300 arrows into them. So just not the greatest, and FromSoft's woes with dragon bosses would continue for a while, and Seath the Scaleless is sadly no exception. You first encounter this Crystal Maniac in his Duke's archives, where he just kills you without you being able to do anything about it. And honestly, that is the best part of this fight, because afterwards you surprisingly don't wake up at the last bonfire, but in a cell and have to work your way out of there. That part's cool, but not actually part of the boss fight. The boss fight itself is in the Crystal Caves, and it consists of you breaking a crystal that insta-heals him if you don't, and afterwards he has like 3 attacks and you just wail on him. One thing this fight does have is the scale you want from a dragon fight, but it's missing all the gameplay. Like, all of it. Not to mention that the boss run is diarrhea again, especially because you have to cross invisible fucking bridges. Could have been a great boss, but it just isn't. Crossbreed Persilla. A boss which gives you the option not to fight her. And honestly, it kind of makes you want to not fight her. But then she says this line.
This land is peaceful. Its inhabitants kind. Its inhabitants.
And you realize that she's a menace that cannot be left alive. Because my Gwyn, what did you just say? So then right after you initiate contact with her, she ghosts you. What else is new, honestly? If you're a Dark Souls player, you should be familiar with that. And the invisibility mechanic with the snow is honestly a quite neat trick. The atmosphere in this entire area is great, the boss arena is neat, the gimmick is neat. So what's missing? Well, any difficulty in the boss fight? If this boss fight proves anything though, it's that violence won't get you chicks. because right after you finally convince her to talk to you, she's just gone. Wonder where she went. Anor Londo is truly a phenomenal area, but if there's any blemish to put on it, it's Dark Anor Londo. The idea behind Dark Anor Londo is actually great, that the view Anor Londo greets you with is actually an illusion, and then you break that illusion. However, what sucks about Dark Anor Londo is that the boss that's central to it, Dark San Gwendolyn, is located in a very annoying place. Now, under normal circumstances there's a bonfire right in front of it, which brings up the question, how is there any issue with it? Well, for whatever reason, Dark Anor Londo deactivates that bonfire, and instead you have to make your way all the way from the first bonfire. And my god, on my first playthrough I was losing my mind over this boss run. Ironically though, the boss itself is another boss run. All he does is run away and you have to run after him while he throws the same 3 attacks at you. The best thing about this boss is the intro cutscene, but the rest sadly just falls flat, just like his chest. I don't think I'm gonna be very controversial here if I say that FromSoft DLCs generally have been abnormally good. There genuinely aren't many DLCs that I can think of that come close to what FromSoft have pretty consistently delivered with their DLCs. Some that maybe come to mind are the Witcher 3 DLCs, the last DLC for Skyrim, or maybe the Binding of Isaac DLCs, but there really aren't many more. The only DLC for Dark Souls 1, Artorias of the Abyss, is no exception. It's a phenomenal DLC, and it starts off with the Sanctuary Guardian. Now, one change you'll immediately recognize with the Sanctuary Guardian for this DLC compared to the main game is the speed is increased by a factor of like 1.5. Everything feels much faster. The Sanctuary Guardian, for example, has a combo that feels unthinkable in the main game and can charge you down across the entire arena in the span of a second. Additionally, the Sanctuary Guardian has a poisonous tail, which discourages the typical attack of going at him from the back. However, and here's where I kind of have to throw in my towel and go with the vague descriptors, I don't know why, but this boss doesn't feel right to me. Something about the animation, the mix of his moveset, doesn't feel like it plays particularly well. I know this is kind of a cop-out, but even after beating him like 5 times, I'm still not totally sure what to think, but I can honestly say I didn't particularly enjoy the fights, but I couldn't tell you why. So here's where I would genuinely like to know if anyone else feels that there's something off with this boss and can explain it, because I can't. Next in the DLC we arrive at the titular Artorias. And here's a summary of how my first encounter with Artorias went. Yeah, can we nerf Great Shields please? That would be really appreciated. Though it is kind of funny and ironic that the Great Shield of Artorias is a direct counter to Artorias himself. So I'll give the game that. Because of this scuffed first encounter, I was kind of iffy on this boss initially. I mean, don't get me wrong, even then I thought it was a great boss. However, how great, I wasn't entirely clear on. It really took a couple playthroughs to appreciate what Knight Artorias really is. And he is 2 things. For one, a blueprint. There are plenty of bosses in future FromSoft games that you can directly trace back to Artorias. And the speed and aggression that Artorias, as well as another boss in the DLC, exudes is something that I think entire future games have been built upon. So going back after having played every other relevant FromSoft game, I didn't think he would hold up. I thought this was a formula that was improved upon, and now going back it's gonna be lackluster. But there's a second thing that Artorias is, and that is a really fucking great boss. I will happily concede that I was wrong. This boss holds up, it more than holds up. Even among all the bosses in future games that were inspired by Artorias, there isn't another boss that throws himself at you in the raw way that Artorias does. After thinking about it some more, and honestly this thought just came as I was recording this voice line, The one boss I would actually compare him to is the Flame Lurker. Both are bosses that throw themselves at you and are absolutely suffocating. So yeah, no, I will fully concede. Artorias is an S tier boss, and there's no discussion about it. Finally, we get to the final boss of the only DLC of the first Dark Souls. Manus, Father of the Abyss. This guy is a fucking menace. He has probably the fastest combo in the entire game, where if he catches you, you better have praised the sun enough beforehand. Honestly, this combo is so fast, it would still be a pretty damn fast combo in Dark Souls 3, a much faster game. Not only probably the fastest enemy in the first Dark Souls, he only has some other stuff to offer too, such as some fairly unique spells, one of which summons a ring around you and him that closes in fast, forcing you to divert your attention to dodge it. Or, I mean, you can use the silver pendant if you're a bitch. If we, just for a second, live in a better world where Dark Souls 2 was never made, then we can see that this DLC really sets the tone for the direction that FromSoft was about to go in. The DLC-wise optional boss in Dark Souls 1 is Black Dragon Calamite, and I honestly don't get why people like this one. I mean, you just stand in one spot, he does the breath attack, and you shoot at him with magic. What's all the fuss about? Really bad jokes aside, if you wanna actually have fun with this fight, you go to Guff, or Go, or however you pronounce him, and he shoots Calamite down for you. Now if you talk to any Dark Souls player, they'll probably tell you that Calamite is a good fight. And I don't disagree. His attacks are well telegraphed, he has a variety of them, and his design is pretty cool. However, there are a couple things that prevent me from ranking him too high. This is a dragon boss, and a dragon boss that was announced basically at the very beginning of the DLC already. So why does he fight like just another beast? His moveset mainly consists of swipes, bites, and the occasional breath attack. Where are the aerial attacks? Where is anything to make him stand out, apart from his eye attack? He also lacks the grandness that I associate with a dragon fight, which isn't a problem by itself, but the stupendously big arena makes the fight just feel very small. Again, my critique of him might seem a bit harsh, and he's still a very good fight, but these are just the reasons why he's not as memorable to me as he is to other people. I don't think this was the point where FromSoft figured out how to make a dragon fight, this was just the point where they made a good beast fight. Now, just to be clear what I'm talking about here, I'm talking about the boss at the end of the game. I'm not talking about the Gwyn that you encounter in the Asylum Demon boss room. I'm not talking about the 4 Gwyns that are in the hallway after that. I'm not talking about the Gwyns that litter Firelink Shrine and the areas around it. No, I'm talking about the actual final boss. Now with that out of the way, if you haven't played Dark Souls 1, it's difficult to describe how this fight is so damn good. You have to realize how this fight is set up. In the very first cutscene of the game, you're introduced to Gwyn as the central figure of the entire universe of Dark Souls. And the entire game is revolving around getting to him and beating him. So then you finally get there. It's a barren landscape, it looks sick, but it looks absolutely destroyed and in ash and ruin. And then you enter the boss room fight, expecting maybe like a cutscene, an introductory to get the fight started. Nope. He's in your face, so you're immediately on alert, and then you realize, oh, this guy has like 4 moves. I mean, his moveset plays well, he's reminiscent of the Penetrator maybe, but what really sticks out is how simple and just brute force it is. He's the only boss in the entire game you can parry. So all in all, it makes it feel like a normal enemy you encounter anywhere else, except he has a health bar, he hits stronger, and he's the final boss that's been built up from the entirety of the game. And then the music hits, and it's just... there aren't many moments in the entire gaming history that I can recall that had this kind of atmosphere. This is a absolutely remarkable fight, and not because it plays insanely well, but for every other reason imaginable. Dark Souls 1 was a marked improvement in terms of bosses from Demon's Souls. Again, not that Demon's Souls was terrible, but this is way more refined, and it had some absolutely fantastic moments. A lot of what Dark Souls 1 did was, however, a lot more safe than what Demon's Souls did, so I do feel like that some of the experimentation got lost in there. But it's still a trade I'm willing to make if this is the result we get. However, if you're concerned that from this point on the quality is only gonna get better and I'm gonna have to rant less, don't worry, because next up is Dark Souls 2. I don't think I've made much of a secret that I'm not the biggest fan of Dark Souls 2, and I think the bosses reflect that pretty well. I did 2 playthroughs of Dark Souls 2. The first one I did on stream. I wanted to go for something completely different than what I did in Dark Souls 1, so I tried to go for a mage build. However, I pretty quickly realized that melee is just way more fun for me, so for the bosses I quite liked, I basically didn't use any magic at all. For my second playthrough, I just straight up went for a strength-based power stance and great swords build. Also at the time I felt that maybe I didn't give this game an 100% fair shot, because when I first played it I just wanted to get it done and move on to Dark Souls 3 for large parts of it. But also now I obviously know the game, so in my second playthrough a lot of the things are gonna be way easier for me. So to mitigate that a bit, I joined a company of champions for pretty much my entire playthrough and only turned it up for 3 specific bosses, which we'll talk about then. If you want any proof that I kept it on, I'm max level in that covenant and I still have some ore stones left. But enough useless talk, let's begin. Dark Souls 2 follows a different structure and branches out early on, so there's not a first boss per se, but if you're being real, for most people and including me, the first boss was the last giant. So one thing that will no doubt become clear over the course of this part of the video, if it isn't already, I'm not the biggest fan of Dark Souls 2, but one thing I'm a huge fan of is the design of the giants. They're one of my favorite humanoidish races in video games ever. Their whole face is super unsettling and makes them seem like they come from an entirely different branch of evolution. So visually I love the last giant. However, gameplay wise this is the laziest motherfucker on the planet. I mean, you just run between his legs and he barely makes any attempt to hit you. He has a second phase where he tears out his arm, which is cool, but again, when you're under him, that doesn't make a fucking difference. There's also the issue that this is effectively the first boss, and honestly, what does it set up for the future aside from the giants themselves? Gameplay wise there aren't many bosses that really resemble the last giant, and the only thing you can say that he teaches you is that fighting under giant enemies is to your advantage, most of the time. He's a completely fine boss by himself, and actually there's a lore snippet here that I'll come to later that is one of my favorite things that FromSoft have ever done lore wise, that is connected directly to this boss. However, he shouldn't have been the first. There's no reason this should have been the first boss. Next up we have maybe the most iconic Dark Souls 2 boss. Maybe iconic is the wrong word, but when I think Dark Souls 2, the one that comes to mind the first is the Pursuer. And that's because not only do you encounter him multiple times during the playthrough, you also encounter him very early on. In fact, so early you could argue he actually comes before the last giant, as there's one encounter you can have with him before the last giant. This is a boss that's gonna pursue you. I know that probably comes as a surprise, but yes, he's gonna pursue you throughout the game. The actual boss fight against him though is fairly early on, and when I say he's the most iconic for Dark Souls 2, I don't mean he's the best, but I think he represents the game as a whole fairly well. He's a big guy in armor with a big sword, which is basically half the bosses of the game, and he fights very much like a Dark Souls 2 boss, in the sense that he has slow, heavy attacks that you can avoid by just walking around him. So yeah, he's not the greatest, but he's still early on. By that point you haven't gotten your fill of that type of boss yet. And the fact that you encounter him multiple times is fairly cool. At the beginning he might kick your ass, but then when you encounter him in the Iron Keep...
Well, well, well. How the turntables...
This is a boss that's honestly really well suited to be the first boss of the game, and it kind of surprises me that he isn't. So, funny story, for a long time this was the boss that I took most attempts on. This might seem ridiculous, but he genuinely took me more than 5 hours and over 130 deaths. Why? Well, picture this. You haven't learned how to dodge really because you cheesed the first Dark Souls with a shield. Your only level up so far went into intelligence, but the magic you have is useless. You didn't even figure out how to level up for a while, so you wasted a ton of souls in the beginning. You don't have the Ring of Binding, nor really any human effigies left, nor do you want to go farming because you're stubborn. So you're stuck at 50% HP. This is obviously also a boss meant to be done a bit later than as your third, and this is the cherry on top. You activated the Company of Champions without knowing that it effectively puts the game into New Game Plus without any of the benefits. So yeah, actually the boss isn't that hard. It's just me that's a fucking idiot. I actually quite like this fight. There's the trade-off of having to fight one on a small platform so you don't have to fight three at the same time, and the Sentinels themselves have a fairly well-rounded moveset, apart from that one spin move that's completely and utter horseshit. But otherwise, they managed to be one of the better bosses of the base Dark Souls 2 game, which, to be fair, isn't that big of a feat, but still, they're good. Bro, look! The rat's got a mohawk! The rat has got a fucking mohawk! How did they come up with this? From sort of fucking geniuses! It's a brilliant move that you have to fight a bunch of rats before the mohawk rat shows up, because that really builds the anticipation for the mohawk rat. And then you have the fucking mohawk rat. Sure, it doesn't have a lot of moves, but it's the fucking mohawk rat! Now the only question that remains is, why aren't more bosses a bunch of rats, but one has a mohawk? Dark Souls 2 has a lot of bosses. Some might argue Dark Souls 2 has too many bosses. I would be one of those people. Dark Souls 2 has so many bosses that are just bland in every way and don't stand out, and I just don't know what to say about them. The Dragon Rider is one of those. It's a big guy in armor with a standard weapon, where the only even remotely standout factor is that you have the choice of raising some platforms in this arena so you have more space to fight, or not raising them and making him take a swim. I don't know what else to say about him. He's blander than modern pop music. Let's just move on. The Flexile Sentry is essentially a pair of Siamese twins that got locked away at the bottom part of a ship to drown. And you're fighting it for whatever reason. Why is a fucking good question I really would like answered. Anyway, for a boss called the Flexile Sentry, it is not very flexile. The idea of it is nice, that you have essentially two different movesets, and depending on who you face, you get to fight different ones, but I really wish there were more attacks involving the side facing away from you, because what ends up happening often is that you just fight one side for 90% of the fight, making the idea have not very much impact. The rising water mechanic honestly also feels pretty unnecessary. All in all though, this is one I give them credit for, as it's an idea and they went with it, and it's not bad. Dark Souls 2's combat has an inherent problem that I heard being described as just turn-based combat, which is a great description, because that is what it boils down to. Often you have bosses and enemies where you just wait for them to make their move, and then they just stand there for a couple seconds so you can get the hits in, and then you dodge again. This is the case for a bunch of bosses and enemies, and one of the worst offenders in my opinion is the Rotten. Smash attack, then takes 5 seconds to pull his cleaver back. Sweep attack, then take 5 seconds to recover. You see the pattern here. And when you realize that this is supposedly one of the big 4 bosses of Dark Souls 2, it really starts to get hard to defend. Not to mention getting to him is a pain thanks to one of Dark Souls 2's favorite things, spamming poison statues at you. This is what Nito turned into. Look how they massacred my boy. When designing Dark Souls 2, the developers must have looked at it this way. 2 is more than 1. So in everything we do, we gotta do more of them. More bosses, more areas, and more gargoyles. How they didn't go off a red light when that suggestion was thrown around, I don't know. But sadly, the Belfry gargoyles are a thing. All this is basically a room of 5 slightly strong enemies plugged into a room and called a boss. Their moveset isn't particularly interesting, the only remotely interesting thing is that they change their behavior based on their health, but that can also make the fight extremely frustrating. Yeah, I don't know. This is another one where I'm just like, why does this exist? This would have been fine as a room full of enemies, honestly. But here we come to the issue they did call it a boss. Why? You know that puts expectations up, and those expectations are not met. If you ever question why you have to put yourself through the torture that is the Balefire Gargoyles, this is the answer: the Lost Sinner. This boss is a mechanic where normally the lights in the room are off, making it harder to see, making the lock-on not work as well, but if you beat the Balefire Gargoyles you can turn the light switch on. In other words, just don't fight the Balefire Gargoyles, because honestly this fight is better without the lights. While I personally would say that Dark Souls 2's core combat system is the least favorite of mine of any From Soft game ever, the Lost Sinner proves that it can still work decently well. This is a boss that's very simple. It has a sword, it attacks you with a sword, and it jumps sometimes. That is it. But it honestly works well. It's a simple boss that actually forces you to roll to use the mechanics the game provides you with. It's a decent boss. Mom, I want Quailag! You already have Quailag at home. Quailag at home? Alright, we get it. Quailag worked, so you tried to recreate it. The only thing you forgot is that Quailag actually played interesting and well. The only really interesting attack this boss has is her going underground, but the hitbox for her getting out feels, as is customary in this game, off. Apart from that, you can stand on her back, so that's cool. Prowling Magus and the Congregation is a boss that exists. It's a bunch of enemies in a room. This is a boss that's so forgettable, it's kind of memorable how forgettable it is. In fact, when I was missing a boss while doing this boss list, it took me half an hour to figure out that the Prowling Magus and the Congregation was the one I was missing. Another horrendous boss run aside, the Duke's Freya is a spider boss, which, thinking about it, FromSoft haven't done a whole lot of spider bosses over the years. Really surprising. Anyway, considering the bosses in Dark Souls 2, the Duke's Freya is actually fairly memorable. It's a spider boss with two heads. That's mostly it. The main issue with this fight is that she's fairly stationary, and the main danger comes from getting webbed, either by her, but mostly by the minions. So the fight boils down to a constant struggle of keeping the minions in check so you don't get webbed from the side. If they just made Freya herself a bit more aggressive, I think this fight could have been pretty damn neat. One of the big tools that the Dark Souls 2 team had, apparently, that the Dark Souls 1 team didn't, is a copy machine, and they used it extensively. The first instance of which is, here's Ornstein again, but he's missing Smoke. The best thing about this fight, honestly in my opinion, is that it really shows that even with some added attacks, Ornstein himself isn't too great of an enemy. It's really the interplay between Ornstein and Smoke that created an amazing boss. Ornstein alone just doesn't cut it. It doesn't matter if you give him some Black Lightning attacks. It won't save it. But don't worry, this is not the last we'll see of the copy machine. I just wanna let you know that I wanna strangle whoever thought this boss run was fine to put in the game the way it is. But let's not focus on that. The Executioner's Chariot is actually a pretty neat boss. You have a chariot that goes around in a circle, and you have to follow it for a while until you can pull a lever, which makes the driver come off, so you can actually fight the boss, which is the horses. That's a gimmick which actually I think works pretty well. I like that part of the fight. The part of the fight I don't like is the part where you fight the horses, because once you stay on their side, they can't do fucking anything. You just slash away at them until they're dead. Still, despite that, I have to say, this is one of the better gimmicks ever used in a boss fight. So props for that. Probably still my most played game of all time is a small indie game called Klonk. Klonk had a level editor. This level editor was extremely basic. You could essentially just control how the world was generated and what enemies and what the player gets at the beginning of the game. Anyone that actually made good levels used the scripting feature. Me, however, being a 10-year-old, didn't know how to script, so I made most of my levels with this. Some of the levels I made, I just plugged in a bunch of skeletons and called it a day. Which is basically what FromSoft did with the skeleton lords. So I think 10-year-old me could work at FromSoft. So consider this my application if they ever make a game like Dark Souls 2 again. The next boss is the Covetous Demon. If you put all the demon bosses in Dark Souls in like an evolutionary diagram, it looks like a devolutionary diagram. And the stage we've arrived on is Jabba the Hutt. I mean, the most dangerous thing this boss has is lazily rolling at you. Forget 10-year-old me, hire 7-year-old me.
What?
Alright, fess up. How many figured out that you could burn the fucking windmill and that would eliminate the poison in the boss room? Who figured that out without a summon or without looking it up? I'm genuinely curious because in my opinion this is worse than the monkey wrench puzzle in Monkey Island 2, where you have to use a monkey as a monkey wrench. That one makes more sense to me than this. Once you drain the poison though, what is left is a boss with like 4 attacks who occasionally throws a head. I mean, I just really struggle with these bosses because I'm really sitting here thinking what could I possibly say, but I just genuinely don't have anything to say about this boss. It's unremarkable in every way except for the windmill gimmick.
For the thousands of attendants and millions watching around the world, are you ready? Put your hands in the air.
For our next contender for worst boss run in any FromSoft game ever, it's the Rat Smelter Demon! You know, I like the Smelter Demon in theory. His design is fairly cool. I however don't love taking damage by being near him. I don't love the terrible hitboxes. And I definitely don't love the fucking run back past 50 sniping samurais. But don't worry, they're gonna use this boss again. And surely they'll realize that having a run back like that is terrible, right? They won't do this again, right? You've heard of that fucking pit? And that fucking branch? Well, get ready for the sequel, or that fucking hole.
I forgot about that hole. There's a hole there. A really fucking ass hole.
Holy shit. I've fallen into this hole more times than I'm willing to admit in my 2 playthroughs of Dark Souls 2. In both it has happened multiple times. In my second playthrough, literally all my deaths came from that hole. What kind of sadist placed this hole here? Anyway, the boss itself is really disappointing. I mean, it's just a really generic demon that has a moveset similar to the fucking Dragon God of all people. At least he's not a gimmick, but he's not particularly fun to fight either, and I'm just happy to be past him. But that fucking hole, man! Whoever put that there, I will find you on Twitter and write a very long and angry twitlonger at you. At least 1 time a year. For the rest of your life. So we've got this spot for a boss in the Doors of Pharos to fill. Any ideas? How about we take Sif, but make his animations way worse by making them less natural and less telegraphed, don't really add any lore to it, and don't even give it some of the basic sounds like for hitting you. What if we make it a rat, and add toxic rats to it that are more dangerous than the actual boss? Do we really need another rat boss in this game?
I'm the giant rat that makes all of the rules. Let's see what kind of trouble we can get ourselves into.
It's 2 fucking Dragon Riders. This is a boss to reuse. No, I don't want to talk about it. Let's move on. Alright, so before we start, what the heck is a looking glass? Oh, it's a mirror. Couldn't have called him Mirror Knight, could you? Leaving aside the fact that this is another big dude in armor with weapon boss, this is one of the few mid to late game highlights Dark Souls 2 has to offer. He probably has the coolest and most natural multiplayer gimmick of any FromSoft boss, and for once, it isn't a complete disappointment in single player. The atmosphere with the weather actually works really well, and although otherwise his moveset is fairly basic, he has some cool lightning attacks sprinkled in as well. In my first playthrough as a mage, his shield actually reflected my spells, which was really cool. This is one of the few times in Dark Souls 2 where I don't have much negative to say. It's a well done boss all around that caps off one of the better areas of the game. The whole Shrine of Amana area is weird. I mean, I think visually it's one of the most striking and memorable areas in the entire game, but everyone hates it, and rightfully so. And then you have the boss, the Demon of Song. It's a frog with a giant eyelid and a human face, which you can close with the eyelid so it doesn't get damaged. So normally you would say that's a unique start, that's something they haven't done before. We can work off that. But they didn't work off it. The boss has like 5 attacks, which consist of a couple swipes, a jump, a ranged attack, and that's about it. And in classic Dark Souls 2 fashion, the fight is very turn-based combat, where you just wait for it to open up and stash it a couple times. And here we have big guy in armor with weapon, but this time it makes a sound when it hits the ground. Best boss in the game! This is one where, sorry, I don't understand why he's so well liked. There's a good bit of atmosphere, and his weapon gives the fight a unique vibe by giving his attacks more impact sonically. But apart from that, he's so standard and boring. Admittedly, these positives are more than I can say for most Dark Souls 2 base game bosses, so he is a good boss, but I fail to see anything that puts him above that level. Phase 2 doesn't even add anything spectacular. I actually think he works better as a part of a duo boss, but we'll get to that later. In Dark Souls 1, Gwyn is a name that's built up from the beginning, and then when he's finally revealed, it makes for a really emotional boss fight. Dark Souls 2 kind of does the same thing with Vendrick. From the beginning of the game I guessed that this would be the Gwyn of the game, it felt very similar. But the end result in this one is actually quite different. While in both cases what you encounter is essentially a lifeless husk, in Dark Souls 1 that husk tries with all its might to keep you away from your goal, but can't really do much because, well, it's a husk. In Dark Souls 2, Vendrick doesn't stand in your way. Whereas Dark Souls 1 converted that into a sad and emotional moment, Dark Souls 2 instead goes for a different direction. It makes it existential, foreboding, shocking. This is King Vendrick, the biggest name in the entire game, and this is what's left of him. Not only that, but this is the path you're on. This is the future you're heading towards. Now the fight itself isn't very interesting. The strength of him depends on the amount of giant souls you have, and Vendrick himself has a very limited and very standard moveset. But like with Gwyn, that's not the focus here. I really like that it's not a carbon copy from Gwyn, while building on some of the same core ideas. And this is where I'll concede one point. While I don't think the story and the lore of Dark Souls 2 matches that of the original in any way, I do think it's cool that it can stand by itself. And this is definitely the highlight of said story. I'm still not convinced From Software didn't hire the writers of Game of Thrones for Dark Souls 2, because this is a masterclass in subverting expectations. I mean, you have this boss arena. This is, in my opinion, one of the sickest looking boss arenas of any game they've ever done. And then you go in and it's a dragon, so you're hyped. But then it comes in. The masterclass in subverting expectations strikes. And you know what they did? It's genius. I would have never thought about it. They gave him no moves. I mean, seriously, this boss has like 4 moves. Just look at the comparison at the wiki pages between the Guardian Dragon and Calamite. And then the real cherry on top out of all this to really sell this subverting of expectations is the OST.
Oh, subverting expectations is tight. Well, I wouldn't say that it was about subverting expectations. It's more that how do I say this, forgot about it. Oh, right.
The writers of Game of Thrones were so good at foreshadowing, they foreshadowed the writing of Season 8 in Dark Souls 2. Oh, you thought we were done after that atrocity? Oh boy, get ready for round number 2. It's Dragon Boss with no moves, but now in big. So big in fact that you are limited in where you can attack him, because even if you immediately react and run at full speed, you won't make it out of his AoE range in time in certain spots. The only thing this fight is going for it is that it's for the first time a true dragon fight that really feels grand in scale. And that feeling is honestly what made me not completely hate it. It's worse than garbage mechanically, but actually fighting a huge dragon is cool. It's a dragon, right? Right? Don't take this from me, FromSoft. Don't make it a giant. Alright, okay. I mean, I guess the lore is pretty cool too. Honestly, I think that the best part of the base game of Dark Souls 2 is the design of the giants. I absolutely love it. So when there was another giant fight, I got unreasonably excited, honestly. And the arena is fucking sick. I mean, it genuinely feels like there's a war going on, which there is. And here's where the lore snippet I mentioned with the last giant comes in. This is the last giant. The last giant is the Giant Lord. And that explains the violent reaction the last giant has when he sees you. Honestly, one of my favorite lore snippets ever. However, just because they're the same person doesn't mean the fight has to be practically the same. This is late game, you could have changed it up more. I mean, the wiki sums it up how interesting this fight is mechanically. It's a real shame, it's genuinely a real shame, it makes me sad. It could have been the best highlight of the base game, honestly. For Dark Souls 1 to get to the optional bosses, for one, you had to just go to the most obvious thing and one of the biggest halls in the entire fucking game. And for the other one, all you had to do is realize that there's just some things that you're never gonna be able to have. Meanwhile, in Dark Souls 2, to get to the most infamous optional boss, all you need to do is join the one correct covenant out of the 50 there are, track down an old man in a wheelchair, go to university, get a PhD in archaeology, track down the old man 2 more times because he goes missing every time you take your eye off him, dig down to the bottom of the earth 3 times, killing everything you come across, while juggling 3 babies with one hand, realize that what you actually needed to do is light 3 random fires in each of the pits you've dug out.
So there's no way for me to do it from in here, huh? Oh.
So you do all that again, but this time turn the light switch on. Then you gotta lift the curse that's been on you since the beginning of your life, dig down to the bottom of the earth one more time, and then you can have one shot at the Dark Lurker. Yeah, that seems reasonable. But it's all worth it because what you get at the end is not only a good mage boss, finally, but also, more importantly, a JoJo reference. I wasn't joking though when I said he was a good mage boss. He genuinely is a really good mage boss. He's got magic spears, magic orbs, he can fire his laser, and he can throw the sun at you. His most dangerous weapon though is that because he has 4 arms, they've apparently fitted one out with a portal gun. So that can fuck you up real bad. So yeah, just a really well made and cool mage boss, finally. Even his visual design is unique and memorable, though to a point where I'm not sure it entirely fits anymore, but it's not a huge deal. The main detracting factor here is that you need to use a human effigy for each attempt at him, which is a mechanic that I absolutely hate. But yeah, aside that, not much negative to say. Wait, what was that? Did you see that?
Look at this. He's multiplying. He's undergoing mitosis.
Yep, there's 2 of them, and they both have a portal gun. This is fucking sick! I didn't think this would work as a duo boss, especially with the lack of cover, but it actually does. So yeah, not much to complain here. This boss absolutely has my approval. When it came to the finale of Dark Souls 2, the dev team really went brainstorming and thought, okay, we need to do something original. Something that really captures the essence of Dark Souls, while being something we've never done before. Thankfully, they abandoned these stupid thoughts quickly and just did Ornstein and Smough again. I kid. The Throne Watcher and Throne Defender, while clearly inspired by Ornstein and Smough, are not that similar. They're not carbon copies. And they actually work fairly well. So overall, surprisingly, good job. The one problem, however, is that you don't really have any options to separate them. The arena is fairly small and doesn't really give you anything like the pillars with Ornstein and Smough to offer up options. Due to that, the fight felt good on my first playthrough as a mage. However, on my second one with melee, it felt kind of unfair, as my best and easiest option was to just trade hits until one goes down. They're also not visually striking enough for one of the final bosses and look like some random NPCs. Still, it's not the worst idea, and it works better than I expected. Okay, I need to have a quick TED talk here. Today's topic is bosses and how they set expectations. Bosses set expectations. Final bosses set even more expectations. There's good reason to not have the final boss be the most mechanically challenging or interesting, but that's no excuse to give it like 4 attacks. However, what is absolutely crucial is to hammer home that this is the finale. This is the conclusion. Whether you do it in an emotional way and tease it from the beginning, I like Gwyn, or do it in a thematic way, like we'll get to talk about in Dark Souls 3. There's many ways to do this. One way, however, not to do this is have it to be a character that you spoke to once and can completely miss even being of any importance whatsoever. Then make it hard to realize that it is even that character. Most players' reactions to seeing this boss is, who? That's not what you want. Not to mention that the fight itself is heavily anticlimactic. I genuinely like her visual design, so it should be even more telling that despite that, I'll still rate her one of the worst bosses FromSoft have ever created. As a side boss, this would have been fine, not as a final boss. This is one of the biggest flops in any FromSoft game ever, and it all just comes back to the expectations versus reality. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Seemingly, FromSoft like halfway agreed with me with what I had to say about Nashanda, since in the re-release of Dark Souls 2 with Scholar of the First Sin, they added Aldia as the final boss. This one does solve some of my complaints. This is a character that's teased throughout the game and we know him well, and he has some nice and very accessible lore. It does feel fitting and final to fight him as the final boss. The only issue being it's still one of the worst fights in the entire game. As the final boss. It's not particularly spectacular, it's just very turn-based as well, because you wait for him to put himself out of flames and then you can hit him a couple of times and he ignites himself again and then you wait and dodge. It's typical Dark Souls 2 combat, I guess, but I don't like typical Dark Souls 2 combat, so I think that's where the issue lies. The DLCs for Dark Souls 2 are an insane step up in quality, and it really makes you question if the same people worked on them as the main game. Crown of the Sunken King is my personal favorite, and we started off strong. Wait, no. Can we just not talk about this bunch of NPCs, please? I like this DLC, I wanna ignore this. Alright. The co-op areas are all garbage, including the bosses. This one is 3 NPCs. At the very least, the arena gives you some room for options, like kiting and shit. That's about the most positive thing I can say about them. NPC fights weren't particularly fun in Dark Souls 2 to begin with, and throwing 3 in a room and calling it a boss should never be forgiven. One of them is literally Havel, for God's sake. What the fuck? Now, while the Gang Squad might not be the promised step up in quality that the DLCs provide, Elana the Squalid Queen is the start of that. This is a boss that on paper I should hate. It's a mage boss that summons enemies. It sounds terrible. However, it works really well. She has a fairly nice range of spells that don't get too repetitive too quickly and keep you on your toes. Her melee is slow and telegraphed but hits hard, but most importantly there are her summons. She can summon some skeletons, which isn't particularly interesting and I would like this fight more without that. Apparently she can also summon some pigs, which sounds hilarious but I've never seen it happen. But the important thing is she can summon Velstadt. Velshot and Ilana actually work really well together. She has huge openings, but he will aggressively pursue you, and her teleport makes it more challenging to find the openings while also making them sometimes attack together. They are way better synchronized than I would have ever thought possible. And if she always summoned him, this would be close to the best double boss fight FromSoft have ever done. Alas, that doesn't always happen. Right after that, we arrive at the final boss of this DLC. Sin the Slumbering Dragon. Despite its name, this guy is anything but slumbering. He's aggressive, he has charge attacks, bite attacks, breath attacks, poison attacks, and what I personally really love is he has a full moveset in the air. This is the first time I was truly and fully convinced by a dragon fight. Even until today, I think this is the most fleshed out dragon fight FromSoft have done. He doesn't just go up in the air and you immediately know what move he's gonna do and he's gonna come right back down. No, he goes in the air, you don't know what he's gonna do, he's maybe gonna stay there for a couple of moves. Yes, that means you can't hit him for a while, but it's not like he stays up there constantly. The fight speed isn't impeded by him flying, making this one of the most fleshed out and well-rounded fights FromSoft have ever done. This is, without a shred of a doubt, to me, the pinnacle of Dark Souls 2. But don't worry, they're gonna use this boss again. And surely they'll realize that having a run back like that is terrible, right? They won't do this again, right?
I'll fucking do it again. I'll fucking do it again.
It's a boss.
I'll fucking do it again. I'll fucking do it again. I'll fucking do it again. I'll fucking do it again.
Now with that atrocity out of the way, let's just forget about that. And let's get to the meat and potatoes of this DLC, or rather the big sword and small sword of the DLC. Because yes, this boss is a big guy in armor, but this time he has two weapons. Although I will say his sword is fairly iconic, so I'll give them a pass for the design. On my first playthrough, this guy didn't strike me as anything special. I don't particularly love the mechanic of the 4 statues that heal him if you don't destroy them. And the fight felt good, but it didn't stand out to me. On re-evaluation after second playthrough though, I have to say this guy went up the ranks quite a bit for me. And the thing that really made him stand out is that his attacks have a lot of weight. With this guy, the developers just basically said, okay, we have a game where the fighting speed is fairly slow. Let's just embrace that. Let's give him super slow attacks, but make them have a lot of weight. And the result is pretty damn good. This is a boss that plays to the strengths of Dark Souls 2's combat system, which I didn't even know existed. The fact that he can swing a sword with a speed slower than a dead grandma and still fuck me up deserves some props, I think. Do you have enough of me complaining about the boss runs in Dark Souls 2 yet? Well, whatever your answer is, get ready for some more, because we're not done. When I said in the intro to this part of the video that I only turned off the Company of Champions for the Dark Lurker because I had to, I was lying. Yeah, I'm a measly fucking liar, because there's 2 more bosses for which I turned the Company of Champions off. And for those I didn't do it out of necessity, I did it for my own sanity. The first of which is the Red Smelter Demon, because what the fuck are those samurais? And you know what? The second one is Sir Lon, because what the fuck are those samurais? You see a pattern here? Fuck those samurais! Honestly, if I had to give an award for worst boss run ever, it has to be Sir Lon. It can only be between the Red Smelter Demon and Sir Lon, and it has to be Sir Lon. You have the same sniping samurais as with the Smelter Demon, but you also have fire-spewing lizards, you have hallways that if one samurai stands in them you can't pass him by, and in the second portion of the boss run you have holes in the floor that if you fall down, good fucking luck. So yeah, I think this boss run goes against the Geneva Convention and we should really take it to court. And it's honestly so bad that it doesn't really matter how good the boss is, I will never love this boss. It's that bad. And it's kinda sad because Sir Lon is actually a well-made fight. He has a very well put together moveset, the arena looks great with the marble floor, and he has a Sudoku gimmick. What more could you want? Well, there's actually 2 more things you could want. One is a boss run that will keep your sanity intact, and the other one is hitboxes that will keep your sanity intact. Because this boss will not only get the worst boss run ever award, but probably also the worst hitboxes ever award. This boss is an absolute joke. They had a great boss and they did everything around him wrong. It is infuriating, honestly. It's one of the hardest to rate bosses because the boss itself is good, but you can't just ignore those massive issues. You can't. Alright, let's take a deep breath and calm down for the last DLC. I say it's the last DLC, this is actually the first DLC I played originally. And to be honest, when I got to this DLC, I was so fucking done with Dark Souls 2. I could not wait to move on. I thought this game was absolute garbage, and I just wanted to get to Dark Souls 3 already. And then I started playing this DLC and I could not believe I was playing the same game. I've said this before, but it's honestly so baffling to me. It would be one thing if the DLC improved in like 1 or 2 areas, but it improved across the board and by such a massive amount. It genuinely makes you wonder if it was just time pressure as to why the base game turned out so much worse. The first boss of this DLC is Ava, the King's Pet. He's a white tiger that your best tactic is to fight under. He's an aggressive beast boss with some magic sprinkled in. I like that he moves away from you sometimes and then comes back in with magic and a charge. He also has a gimmick where he's invisible at first, but if you keep exploring you can make him visible via an item. All this is good. It's not groundbreaking, it won't put him on a podium, but it's just all around good. And that's something I was sorely missing from Dark Souls 2 base game. So when I first fought this boss, I was ecstatic. On my second playthrough he didn't strike me as that special, but in my first time when I played him it was exactly what I needed. And it gave me some hope for the rest of the DLCs. Let it be known to everyone out there that I beat this fucking boss without summons with the Company of Champions active. Just so I prove once and for all that I can do it, so I never have to ever touch this piece of shit again. Everyone knows that the frigid outskirts are a fucking atrocity, and while the enemies themselves are fine, my god, you reused a boss from the same DLC, and the only thing you really added is that now there's 2 of them and one has a stupid, really fucking stupid healing mechanic. It is mind-boggling that this is a thing that exists. The Burnt Ivory King. Okay, I dread talking about this one, but let's do it. This is in some ways also a final boss of Dark Souls 2, and honestly the Burnt Ivory King is a really cool idea. You gather your troops and drop into basically hell to have an epic battle with corrupted versions of your troops before a giant portal opens up so the king can walk out and spank your ass. This all sounds great on paper, until you realize your troops literally just stand there while 5 enemy knights pursue you. Not only that, but I've had it happen multiple times where 2 enemy mages were each getting spanked by 2 of my guys, but were still focusing all of their attacks on me, while 2 other melee enemies were on my ass. Then there comes the issue with your guys sacrificing themselves to seal the portal so you don't have to deal with normal enemies while fighting the boss. Sounds great on paper, right? Well, what if they don't? Multiple times I've had it happen so that 2 knights were left with 1 portal open and they just wouldn't sacrifice themselves and the boss would spawn with enemies still spawning. Eventually I figured out that their sacrifice seems to be tied either to the total amount of enemies summoned or time. This means I was being punished for killing my enemies too quickly. Fucking amazing. And then you realize that you gotta go through that again every single time you fight the boss, making the Burnt Ivory King in some ways eligible for the worst boss run reward. But enough about that. At least the boss itself is nice, right? Well, he looks very similar to the normal enemies. His moveset is basic and he has terrible hitboxes. My god. This game is just cursed to not have a good final boss, isn't it? Oh, by the way, if you wanna actually complete 100% of the game, you gotta kill those enemies until you get 50 of their souls. They sometimes drop. They really had to put the cherry on the cake, huh? Only the cake is burnt and the cherry is rotten. Honestly, the DLCs kind of saved Dark Souls 2 for me. I still don't think it's a particularly good game, but in the end the overall experience was okay. I don't even think the bosses are the worst part about Dark Souls 2, I think there's other things where the game absolutely dropped the ball. Like some of the basic game mechanics like adaptability and the life gems. but that's a topic for another day. So for now, let's move on and get to some of the good shit. I am of course talking about Bloodborne. I have a PS4. I bought the PS4 just for Bloodborne. I don't have any other games on it. I don't plan on getting any other games on it. So on my first run I actually streamed it on Twitch. You can find it on my channel. And there I very early on picked up the Kirk Hammer and basically used that for the entire playthrough, going for a strength build. In my second playthrough on the other hand, I quickly went to the DLC to pick up the Beast Hunter Scythe and used that with a skill build for the entire playthrough. In both runs I also set myself a level cap to make it a bit more of a challenge in the endgame. That cap is quite a bit lower in the second run because, well, I knew the game and I wanted to make it a bit more challenging for myself. My PS4 can't handle streaming in 1080p, so again the only way I had to get good footage was by taking it from other people, who will again be credited. Be assured though that this is at least the last time. For the last 3 games, Dark Souls 3, Sekiro and Elden Ring, I will be using my own footage. But enough of me blabbering about useless things, here's me blabbering about some Bloodborne bosses. Starting off in Bloodborne after you get mauled by a werewolf or alternatively fist a werewolf. And then talk to the lovely townsfolk through some window and doors.
I don't reckon you're from round here. Well, stuck outside on a night of the hunt. How you poor thing.
You get directed to the obvious landmark in the area, the Great Bridge, upon which you meet the Cleric Beast. The Cleric Beast is what happens in a cursed alternate timeline in Dark Souls 1, where instead of Sif helping you defeat Manus, he falls in love at first sight and they have a family, and this is their son. I definitely don't mind them revisiting Manus' design, as it was a great design and it fits here perfectly. This is the game's introduction to the beast type bosses, a type of boss you'll see a lot during the game. And for those, he's a great intro. He has all the basic attacks, he has some nice jumps that can throw you off. And here's a point where I have to praise the animation, as even when you're under him and don't have a full view of him, you can still most of the time clearly tell by his body language what move he's gonna do. My main negative point here is that you can stagger him with like 2 bullets. That's just stupid. He's by no means a hard boss even in the beginning, there was no need to do that. But otherwise, I mean, he even rewards exploration with the Molotov cocktails. So yeah, just overall a very solid intro boss. Going further, only talking to the most lovely of townsfolk out there.
Well, if you hadn't have got off your arse, it wouldn't be in this mess. You're obligated to help me, you hear? You're good for nothing. No respect for the elderly is what that is.
Eventually you'll come across a little girl whose mom has gone outside to look for her dad. Actually not quite an orphan yet. You can find her dad a bit later on. He's the first mandatory boss, as the Cleric Beast was actually optional. Whereas the Cleric Beast was the introduction to the Beast type bosses, Father Gascoigne is the introduction to the Hunter type bosses. The first 2 phases are basically just like you fighting another player who wields an axe and a shotgun. It's nothing too special, but he's aggressive and it plays decently. Well, apart from the arena. Some people seem to think the arena is brilliant. I think it's atrociously bad. I hate cheesing bosses. I wanna actually fight the boss. I wanna have fun with him. I wanna learn his pattern, figure him out. I can't really do that if he gets stuck on a gravestone every 3 fucking seconds. Eventually I just started running up to the stairs where there's a bit of free room where you can actually fight him. Turns out though, this is actually the most common cheese spot. So yeah, great arena. Absolutely fucking amazing. What is cool though, in his 3rd phase where he turns into a beast, not only does the fight change considerably, it can be a real surprise and it's really fucking cool, but also now he can destroy the gravestones. So while I absolutely hate the arena in the first 2 phases, in the 3rd one it makes some kind of sense. You can also cheese him with a music box that you get from the little girl, but I mean for that you actually have to do something for her. And fuck them orphans, am I right? Anyway, good boss. Bloodborne is off to a strong start. Old Yharnam is one of my favorite areas of the game. You have an old, abandoned by beasts overrun town with a guy with a machine gun up top that rains fire down on you. It has a great atmosphere and a great build up to the boss, who is a dog on 4 legs that inflicts poison. The Bloodstaff Beast is fine as a boss, but it really doesn't do anything special. There's nothing that stands out about it in a good way, and the only mechanic it has that's unique to it is that it inflicts poison when you're near it in the last phase, which is an absolutely terrible mechanic. Once you realize that all its attacks come from one side, it becomes a joke mechanically. So yeah, not much more to say about this one. The best thing about this boss is honestly the arena, and even that one doesn't rank that high overall in the game. After the dog, you can let yourself get sacked to fight this bony boy. I took the intense physics course in my school, and I had no idea bones could conduct electricity so fucking well. What is not well in this fight, however, is the camera controls. I hate controllers, you know? I hate them. Why can't I play this thing with mouse and keyboard like a normal human being? In fairness, when I first fought him, I didn't realize there were other lock-on points on him, so that's my bad, that's completely on me. However, this is still a fight where it being on PS4 and me having to use a fucking controller, which is not a way to control a character in a video game, but instead it's just a torture device. I don't know who voluntarily plays games like this, but I digress. The first time I fought this guy, it was a very 50-50 fight, in the sense that for 50% of it, I was just mauling at the controls and absolutely losing every inch of my hair. And for the other 50% I was really fucking enjoying what I was doing. BAM! Whew! Because eventually I just gave up on the camera and decided instead of running away from him, which is where the camera really hurt me, I was just gonna stay under him, and when he does the AoE, I'm gonna dodge through it. And that made for a really exhilarating fight, to be honest. On my second playthrough, once I knew that you could break his legs, he barely got an attack off after I first broke his leg, and he was a complete joke. So in the end, the 3 experiences I had were great, awful, and just kind of bland. So somehow this comes out to be an average boss. The first key boss fight in Bloodborne story-wise ends up being Vicar Amelia, and I'm gonna make this one really short, because honestly, I don't have much to say. Both times I beat her first try without really putting in any effort. The second time I beat her, I did it while explaining the game to someone next to me. Obviously the build-up is cool with the cathedral, and I honestly really like her visual design. But this ended up being for me by far the easiest fight in the entirety of Bloodborne. It didn't really feel like a boss fight, instead it was more of just a punching bag for me. Next up are the Witches of Hemwick, and this is a boss that has a similar reputation to Pinwheel. No. Actually dead. However, as you can see by this statistic, they're infinitely harder. But yeah, other than that, this is just a boring boss in most senses. It's just a wild goose chase around the room, but the enemies which are supposed to be the danger to you are slower than my dead grandmother. So yeah, unless you get caught by that one attack, this is just a massive waste of time. The Nazguls of Yharnam are an interesting one because there really aren't any comparable fights. Not only are there very few triple bosses in all From Software games combined, even those that are quite different. For example, the Ruin Sentinels are basically a 1v1 and a 1v2, and they don't change during the fight. The Shadows on the other hand have 3 phases and can enter these phases on maybe not the most intuitive conditions, but gameplay wise these make sense. But while the theory around them is nice and the arena isn't too bad either, their visual and gameplay design is very bland, as they don't play that differently from normal enemies, only now you're forced to fight 3. The Snecko attack in phase 3 is a nice touch, but this fight needed more character beyond just being a triple fight, which is really the only way it stands out. Rom the... wait, give me a second. A poem, if you will. Rom, the blank, vacant, expressionless, deadpan, inscrutable, inexpressive, emotionless, impassive, absent, absent-minded, uninterested, empty, glassy, stony, wooden, motionless, lifeless, inanimate, empty-headed, unintelligent, brainless, dense, dull-witted, thick, inane, stupid, brain-dead spider is a critical boss to the progression of Bloodborne, since after beating this boss you finally see the Blood Moon. So that's pretty cool, and I guess you could say this is the first time you actually quote-unquote swim in a Souls game, And then you realize the boss is the hungry caterpillar, but he has a horde of smaller caterpillars. Which sounds familiar at first, but then you realize you can just hack him down and ignore the small ones because he doesn't particularly do much of anything. And then he's dead. So yeah, the synonyms that really work well here are blank and empty, since that is really what I feel about this boss. Challenging Dark Lurker for one of the most obscure bosses to find is Martyr Logarius. And just like Dark Lurker, this is also one of the best bosses in the base game. This guy starts off in his ghost phase, where he just throws a bunch of skulls at you. That phase almost suggests that you're the aggressor here and he's the defender. But make no mistake here, the roles are reversed. Because as soon as you piss him off, oh, he is pissed off. This old man has clearly challenged the Grim Reaper and won and took his scythe, because he can beat anyone in a fitness contest with the way he's flying across the roof. In addition to that, at some point he will make it rain swords, so you better keep track of that and get rid of that as soon as possible. All this makes up for just a worthy send-off for Prince Philip. One Reborn, huh? Gotta say, I expected more from the new Matrix movie. While this boss is visually another case of what the fuck are you actually looking at, the fight itself revolves around killing the bunch of chime maidens that are up above, and then just mercilessly beating down on him until he's dead. He barely even fights back. This boss is one of the biggest build-ups in the entire game. I mean, think about it. Earlier on you can get kidnapped to the Hypogean jail, and there you already see the big gate that the street leads down to, but you can't get there yet. Then later on in Yahar'gul, you finally get there with a massive street that goes all the way down, with enemies side by side, and then you finally get there, and you're presented with a clump of a boss. This is just a boss that's equivalent to a poop nugget. Let's move on. The amygdala are one of my favorite things in Bloodborne. Their creepy omnipresence is really haunting once you realize they've always been there. Their design is super cool, and once I saw how it was conveyed what they actually are through the statues in Yahar'gul, I became an even bigger fan. So it really hurts that the actual amygdala boss fight is not great. The main issue being that it's just stupidly hard to actually hit. You do next to no damage to his feet, so unless you want to make a battle of endurance, you gotta go for his head and arms. But that makes this one of the rare cases outside of Dark Souls 2 of turn-based combat, because after half of the attacks the amygdala just lays low to give you a chance to actually hit him for once. Not to mention the arms, the easy attack points if you don't really have a long or high swinging weapon, have an additional issue that you can't lock onto them. This wouldn't be an issue on PC, but it's a PS4 exclusive, so you're gonna have to battle with terrible controls on the controller to actually hit the arms. This one could have been truly special, but it wasn't. Meme Collage, host of Meme Review, is, aside from his successful YouTube presence, also a boss in Bloodborne. And he fucking sucks! There's no other way to put it. All the memes aside, all this boss is chasing him around a room, and then he uses one attack, and then you chase him again, and then he uses two attacks, one of which can one-hit you. What the fuck? Excuse me? This is the same game that had fucking Martyr Logarius as a boss. What the fuck? Since Bloodborne is a very normal game, the goal of the quest you embark upon at the beginning of the game is to kill an invisible infant by killing its invisible wet nurse, which might or might not be the child itself. And if it's the child itself, someone take away the blades from the baby. And don't mind the crying mother standing right outside the room. Just ignore her. As you would expect from a baby, this isn't the most mechanically deep fight, however the atmosphere in this fight is amazing. What really solidifies this fight to me as a well done fight is the darkness move this boss has, where the entire arena gets dark, and if the HP of the boss is low enough, it creates clones of itself that attack you and then immediately vanish. It's a suffocating feeling being in there and just having to run around and wait it out. Some of the other attacks of the boss also work in that direction, such as the flailing around that you kind of just have to wait out. So yeah, overall a really well done fight, where the only issue with it is really the amount of elevators you have to take to get to it. The other optional area is the Upper Cathedral Ward, where you'll meet a horde of blue aliens, aka the Blue Man Group. It's essentially the Royal Red Vanguard again, but this time the one you need to kill doesn't even have a mohawk. All they do is swing at you. It's the same thing again. At least they're not rats? After the Blue Man Group you can fight Ibrieda's Daughter of the Cosmos. A lot of people seem to struggle with this boss, so to give you an idea of my experience, here's one of my early runs. Maybe the monocular is the key to fighting this guy. I'm gonna fight like this. I can't turn. It's so slow to turn. Fuck. Yep. I can't see. Don't attack me. Where are you? How am I still alive? So yeah, I think we can safely agree that the monocular is overpowered and shouldn't be used against the boss. Jokes aside, while the presentation in this fight is great, it's visually one of the most interesting bosses in the game, I feel like it's mechanically very lacking. Pretty much all of its attacks can be avoided by just being behind it or slightly to the side of it, and then you just hack away at it. The only attack that really poses any danger is a Call Beyond. And honestly, the second time I played it, it did take me a couple of attempts to really figure out what to do against a Call Beyond, but once I did that, the entire fight becomes super easy. So yeah, considering that the optional bosses in these games are usually the most mechanically interesting and difficult, this one is sadly a bit of a disappointment. After you watch your one place of respite burn to the ground, you end up fighting the old guy in the wheelchair, who, guess what, didn't need the wheelchair at all. Not only can he walk, run, he can jump, he can fucking fly! So yeah, he only did that to pay less taxes, that's for sure. But don't worry, you won't have any time to be mad at him for debating you, because the fight is so good you'll only be able to focus on that. Not only does the Burial Blade have a very different and interesting moveset that makes the fight unique even though you're just fighting mostly a hunter with a weapon, but the one thing I usually relied on with hunter fights was staggering or poise breaking, because that was fairly easy with most hunters, but as soon as he powers up into his second phase, you can't do that as easily anymore. So even though it is still a hunter versus hunter fight, it plays completely differently. But the fun thing about this fight is that the mechanics aren't even the highlight here. The highlight is the atmosphere. The visuals with the arena and the background plus the music make for a really fitting final fight. But don't worry, this is only part 1.
O Flora of the moon, of the dream, O little ones, O fleeting will of the ancients, let the hunter be safe, let him find comfort, and let this dream, his captor, foretell a pleasant awakening.
If you've done the very ethical deed of consuming 3 umbilical cords, and maybe killing a mother or 2 in the process. So this is gonna be hard to aim. It was a headshot! We don't talk about the Pebble incident. Then you'll meet Flora, aka the Moon Presence. While this isn't a boss that was directly foreshadowed at any point, it was hinted at through multiple elements throughout the game. While this surely isn't the most interesting boss mechanically, look at it. Tell me that doesn't look fucking awesome. This is maybe my favorite boss ever in terms of visual design. I love everything about it. The open ribcage, the tentacles, the like half face, the thin limbs. Nothing's quite right about it, and that makes it perfectly right. The moveset of this boss is comprised of mostly basic attacks and then attacks that set your HP to 1. As such, this isn't a boss that requires a lot of time to figure out, but it requires you to think quickly. As a final boss, you wouldn't exactly want two mechanically deep bosses back to back. That is better saved up for an optional side boss. So in that sense, I completely get what they're going for and I agree with it. However, tell me, why can you just fight the Moon Presence solo? Unlike a lot of other dual bosses, once you beat the first one, you only have to fight the second one. Which might sound great on paper, but it makes the Moon Presence a joke. This is a boss that from the ground up I feel like is designed to be a follow-up boss to German, where you always have to beat German first and then have to concentrate and react quickly and think quickly, but it's not too difficult that it completely overwhelms you. But that's not the case! Why is it not the case? Someone explain that to me. I don't get it. So in the end, it all culminates in this. All the suffering, the grotesqueness, everything culminates and peaks in a horse. Ludwig the Accursed is the sign that you're in for a fucking treat. This is the first boss of the DLC. Let me repeat this. This is the first boss. And not only is it the first boss, it's also the cinematically best boss they've ever done to this day. During the main game, the name Ludwig will come up again and again. You'll see me mentioned in weapon names, in item descriptions, and by NPCs. So then, when you finally see Ludwig, this is what you get. What even are you looking at? It's such a subversion of expectation, but not in the Game of Thrones way, in the actual good way. Gameplay wise, this first phase is one of the most suffocating things they've ever created. This is a beast boss, where if you fight Unknown, he might just stomp you to death. If you fight in front of him, he will run you over. Oh, you don't see him? He's coming down on you. Ludwig in the first phase is an absolute menace. But the best thing about this boss isn't anything gameplay related. It's the cutscene transition from first to second phase. You finally see, oh, that guy has a human face. Oh, that guy had a sword on his back. That sword now glows blue. That's strangely familiar. Now he's holding it and is gonna whoop your fucking ass with it. This is my favorite cutscene in the entire game for what it does with the expectation with what you've seen and how it transitions it further into the second phase. And we all know the second phase is fucking amazing. Not to talk about the fucking music. For someone who's normally critical about the FromSoft music, I don't have anything to criticize here. This is perfection. This is very, very close to a perfect boss. Okay, this is another boss that wants me to submit myself to the insane asylum, because I don't get it. I really don't. This is a boss that is just comprised of a couple of enemies that instantly respawn, that aren't even really fun to fight as enemies by themselves. They have one cool attack, which again is half HP, which just involves you standing in a specific spot to be safe from it, which makes it immediately half as cool. But then, that fucking boss has one of the best OSTs ever. Listen to this shit. Why this boss? Why does this boss have this OST? I am losing my mind. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Soul Cinder. Our first offer is Lady Maria of the Clock Tower. She is searching for a soulmate, as she's a very Bloody Mary and struggles to keep up a relationship due to her fiery passion. She will keep you on your toes. She is hot, but she can also be a corpse if you want her to be. Lady Maria and in general the hunter bosses are an interesting case because they, and especially Lady Maria, is largely based just on her weapon. Most of her attacks just come directly from a weapon and are pretty standard. But if you thought that wasn't enough, let's add blood to every slash so it has 3 times the length. That wasn't enough, let's add a delayed fire to every attack. It ramps up one by one, and by the end, it is a spectacle. It plays well. My only complaint really is, I think if they would have given her 2 or 3 more like really special attacks just for her, this fight would have been fucking amazing. But as it stands, I think it's a bit too much based just on her weapon, and it's just a bit too easy. In a DLC where most of the bosses will kick your ass to oblivion and back, she's just not gonna be as memorable when I beat her in 2 attacks. But otherwise, this is a fantastic fight, and gameplay wise, maybe the best hunter fight in the game. Okay, so I beat Orphan of course just now in my second playthrough and I need to fucking rant. So here's the issue. Anyone that played Skyrim knows that Orphans are pretty damn hard to kill. In Skyrim, it's pretty much impossible without a mod. However, somehow, this motherfucker manages to be harder to kill than even invincible children. Just to give you an idea of how difficult this boss is, when I first played him, I was clear on the fact that this is the hardest boss I've played. There might have been other bosses that took me longer, but that was due to circumstances. This one is just difficult. It took me like 4 hours. Now when I did my replaythrough, even though I limited myself in terms of leveling and everything, I still beat most bosses in far quicker time than the first playthrough, and the ones that took me a little bit longer were the ones that I just smashed on the first playthrough and never really learned. This motherfucker, I spent 4 hours on. I knew him. On my replaythrough, he took me more than 4 hours. I don't know what the fuck they did with this motherfucker. Somehow a fucking placenta is the strongest weapon in the game. It is insanity. Anyway, this is a pretty fucking great boss, and I love it. But I also fucking hate it. But I do love it. This might be hard to believe, but despite being German, I'm normally not much of a rager. It has gotten worse the last few years, thanks to my teammates in CSGO, but honestly, who can blame me there? However, the only time I've ever damaged my equipment over a game was at this boss, Lawrence the First Vicar. When I played him, I did this. I dented my controller. Only slightly, it's not too bad, I just smashed it on the table once. I didn't throw it across the room. It could have been much worse. And I'm certainly not the only one who feels a little bit of anger towards this boss.
Take my advice, don't fight Lawrence, you only lose a part of yourself.
The main 2 reasons as to why I got flipped off fighting this boss was, for one, this boss has the worst boss run in the entire game, by far. Having Cthulhu alone in your way is already bad enough, but then you have the ball you gotta wait out and a bunch of other things. It's just a terrible and annoying boss run, especially when you do it for 4 hours. Now when I say 4 hours, yes, this boss took me 4 hours on my first attempt. However, he's not that difficult. I just got really tilted and ran in head first without thinking for over 2 hours. For comparison, in my second playthrough I beat him in less than half an hour in a couple of attempts. And the second reason are hitbox issues. Now I'm honestly not 100% sure if there actually are some serious hitbox issues here, or if it's just because I struggle with the camera. It looks like there are some hitbox issues. Either way, end result is it feels like it has some. However, apart from these 2 factors, I actually really like this boss. The OST is great, it's a great way to bring back one of the very early game bosses and give him some new spice. And even the third phase that a lot of people hate, I don't mind that much because it's fairly short and you can get used to it fairly quickly. So overall, this is honestly a really cool and intense fight that sadly just has 2 massive issues attached to it. So yeah, Bloodborne is a damn good game. I don't even think the bosses is where this game shines the most. So it's really incredible. The only thing it's missing is a fucking PC port. That is really the only thing I can complain about. Although even with it being on PS4, I would argue that the Old Hunters is the single best release FromSoft have ever done. Although there you can obviously argue that a DLC doesn't stand alone and it's obviously much shorter than the main games. But if you look past that fact, the Old Hunters has some of the best areas they've ever done, it has some of the best bosses, the best music, some of the best weapons. It's just overall fucking incredible. But we're done with Bloodborne now, so back to PC we go and never going back to the fucking PS4. Because next is Dark Souls 3. I did the full playthroughs of Dark Souls 3, although I did start a bunch more, like one pyromancy build, which I banned like halfway through because I realized melee is just way more fun. The first playthrough, which again I streamed and the VODs are available on my channel. In that playthrough I had a really bad joke going that the swordsman you encounter in the Cemetery of Ash, which drops the Uchigatana, is my master, and I have to follow in his footsteps, so I only used his clothes and the Uchigatana, so it ended up being a dex build. Actually, my second playthrough with that one also ended up being a dex build, though this time I did use a scythe. And in my third playthrough, which I did for this video, unlike Bloodborne, I didn't set myself a level cap or anything like that, but I did force myself to play through the game with the Erythral Straightsword, which is known as a bit of a noob trap, so that was a bit of a limiting factor, and in addition, I didn't go exploring at all, I pretty much only did the bosses. So Dark Souls 3, 2, 1, let's go! For Dark Souls 3, From Software truly went back into their think tank and thought, okay, we've tried slow and big bosses, we've had Mangard, we've had the Asylum Demon, we've had the Last Giant, you could even argue the Cleric Beast. What can we do that's new and exciting and has never been done before? Oh right, I got it. You won't believe this shit. It's a big guy in armor with a big weapon. And honestly, I can't blame them because it fucking worked. I mean, this is the boss I fought the most. I started more save files in Dark Souls 3 to fight this guy than I ever had in all From Software games combined. I love this boss. He teaches you everything. Parries, fast combos, jumps, grabs, camera control. All of this while being fun to fight even for a recurring player. And as soon as you think you figured him out, he goes into phase 2 and teaches you his biggest lesson. Stay calm, motherfucker. Contrary to what visuals suggest, phase 2 it plays very similarly, as long as you keep your cool and watch closely. This is the perfect teaching tool and the perfect tutorial boss. My philosophy when looking at the start of games is that the first part should teach you how the game works, and the second part should really pull you in and show you that this game is worth playing. Ward of the Boreal Valley is the second boss of Dark Souls 3, and I can't really say that this is the boss that convinced me that Dark Souls 3 was the shit. However, the advantage that Dark Souls 3 has is that Iudex Gandia already did that, so it's not nearly as detrimental. This is a fairly basic beast boss where you fight under him and then he can't really do much about you, and you really only gotta look out for his charges. The boss one is slightly annoying, but there have been worse, and the reward you get for beating him with the view afterwards is quite great. Overall, this ends up being just about an average boss and begins what I would call the early low in boss quality in Dark Souls 3, but honestly, it's not a bad boss by itself. You hit gross postures until they burst. Honestly, 10 out of 10. The setup for this fight is honestly really cool. The transition to phase 2 is really cool. The visual design is really fucking cool. The gameplay is not. It's just another gimmick boss that sacrifices gameplay in favor of cinematics. But hey, at least cinematically, I think this fight is really cool. So I can't be too mad, and at least with the hand in the second phase there's some gameplay depth. It could have been worse. The Crystal Sage proves that Miyazaki has really long arms, because he must have reached deep into that trash bag to pull Pinwheel out again. And honestly, it's just hard to say something about a boss that's Pinwheel but not quite as much of a joke. You can parry him, which is something that I didn't know until I found it out recently, and that's kinda cool. It is a good change that parries now are sometimes used for in boss fights, but otherwise, I mean, There's just not much to say about it. It's just another one to add to the early low Dark Souls 3 has in terms of bosses. Okay, hear me out here. Yes, the Deacons of the Deep are kind of, again, the Royal Rat Vanguard, but without a Mohawk. So they should be worse. However, I actually don't dislike this boss. I think having your target move around between the Deacons was a nice touch, honestly. And there are some cool attacks in there, like them darkening the sky and cursing you with it. The atmosphere in this fight I think is great. The arena is fucking amazing. Gameplay wise, however, yes, it's an upgraded Royal Rat Vanguard, so I can't give it too high of a rating. If only the Archdeacon had a Mohawk. Imagine that. After a relatively weak start considering what's about to come, giving us a taste of that is now the Abyss Watchers. This is a boss that's the answer to the ever-long, over centuries debated question of what happens to the equation x² minus x when you plug in Artorias for x. The answer is a fucking great boss. I guess you could argue that this is a triple boss as there's 3 of them, but in reality it's not a true triple boss as there's only one you actually need to fight. The way the first phase is designed with one of them turning against the other 2 gives the entire fight a whole different feel and strategy to it. You don't just go in and try to not get hit and hit as much as you can, you could just stay back and go in when you need to. After that phase 2 hits and suddenly it's a full on boss fight one-on-one. My struggle with this boss is there's nothing I can really point to that it does wrong. Everything is done very well. However, there are simply other bosses, and a lot of them, that are more fun to fight. That's simply what it comes down to in the end. I think this is a boss that needed a bit more je ne sais quoi to truly make it one of the greats. But even without that, it's a great boss. Next up, you can interact with the Holy Grail to be taken to the Holy Land itself.
Hey, you're finally awake.
Here you'll meet the Bone Daddy himself, and honestly, if there's one thing he needs is stronger bones, because all that seems to hold his bones together is some bracelets. This is another gimmick boss where you hit the bracelets a couple times and he's dead. If you don't know what to do, this fight can actually have a little something. For example, the first time I played this boss, I didn't know what to do, and I got pushed back all the way up against the wall and I felt cornered. And then the fight has something. Sadly, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the glowing thing is what you need to hit, and once you know that, he barely gets to attack. So what else is there to say here? The whole demon storyline kind of fell by the wayside in Dark Souls 2. We didn't really get our demon boss. Alright, that thing existed. I'm just gonna forget it existed again, okay? So after not having a demon boss in Dark Souls 2, we finally get one again in Dark Souls 3 with the old Demon King. This to me definitely was them wrapping up and finishing up the demon storyline, and the old Demon King is honestly a pretty neat boss. He fights well, the arena has a lot of space but also gives you room to kite him around a bit. He has some neat attacks like the fire ring and the meteors, but honestly my favorite part about this fight is the gimmick that you get when he does his last breath attack, where you get him low and then he explodes for a last time, letting out a little bit of flame that was still inside him, and after that all he can do is very softly swing his hammer at you. It's honestly a great moment and very well done. The only real issue with this fight is it's very safe. It really didn't take any creative risks. It's pretty much what you would expect from a demon boss in Dark Souls 3. So in that sense it's a bit disappointing, but otherwise it's just a good boss. Welcome to our humble dining hall. Take a seat on one of the many benches that will surely not get destroyed during the boss fight. Today we have our classic 2 and 3 combos. We also have our spicy 4 and 5 combos. But if you're feeling really spicy, we have 6 combos. And if that's not enough, we can just double all that. No big deal. Pontiff Sullivan is the quintessence of why I think Dark Souls 3 is still fun as fuck. I mean, sure, the fighting isn't particularly balanced with R1 just being way better than anything else, But all that doesn't fucking matter when you have bosses like this, where just R1 and rolling is so fucking satisfying. If you remember any name from the opening cinematic of Dark Souls 3, it's Yohan the Giant. Story-wise, this fight is incredible and brings to close the Sieg's dynasty. Visually, this fight is also incredible. Once again though, we all know it, it's a gimmick fight that sacrifices gameplay for cinematic effect. This is one where it really wasn't necessary. You could have given him a lot more health, could have given him a way more advanced moveset to make the fight an actual fight past figuring out the gimmick. It still works well here, but the wait for a gimmick boss that manages both gameplay and cinematics in tandem is still ongoing at this point. It took me way too fucking long to realize that this is the sludge from the intro cinematic. Yeah, just don't ask, okay? Anyway, the whole of Anolondo is fanservice. We all know it, but fanservice doesn't have to be bad, and Aldrich is by no means a bad boss. Bringing back Ornstein and Smo's arena is honestly very welcome, and so is the reveal of which god Aldrich devoured. It's fitting. The gameplay could have used some fine-tuning though. I usually have no problem with the fight being built around one attack that's much harder than the rest. It can actually work well. However, his error barrage isn't hard, it's just annoying. And that's really the main culprit for why this fight isn't any better than it is. After kicking the ass of 3 lords, you'll get transported back to the High Wall of Lothric, where you'll meet the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. I don't know how many people I'm gonna lose here, but the Dancer of the Boreal Valley is one of my favorite bosses they've ever done. Now, for everyone I haven't lost here, let me explain. For starters, name one other boss that fights you like this. Looking to the side, walking around you, dancing around you. Name one. The animations, her moveset, everything in this fight flows so well. So incredibly well. The music, the ambience, the arena, everything comes together for a great atmosphere, but the atmosphere isn't even the highlight. If you get into the groove fighting this boss, it's so much fun to dodge her combos. There isn't another boss where it's as fun to dodge the combos as for this boss. It genuinely feels like a dance. On pretty much all my replaythroughs, this was the boss in the entire game that took me the longest. On every single replaythrough. And I've enjoyed it every time. This is a boss that never gets easy, it's completely fair, and while you could say it's a fairly standard melee boss that just has long combos, I feel like she fights very differently from every other boss. And I haven't even touched on phase 2, which ramps up the fight to be twice as great. I love this fight. I love everything about it. If there's any fellow dancer enjoyers, let me know. This boss is incredible. Ocelot memes aside, this one is very disappointing. This was the chance to bring in a truly great mage boss, something that the series is sorely lacking, and yet phase 2 of this guy is mainly characterized by an instant charge. Who doesn't love a good instant charge? I mean, come on, it's everyone's favorite, right? The reveal of the untethered graves is one of my favorite things in the entire game and gives me chills to this day, and Champion Gundyr is the perfect way to cap it off. No more teaching, now it's thrashing time. No more here I come, be ready to parry, now it's here I am, bitch. This is how you reuse a boss within a game. You do it way later, take the fun parts of it and expand on them. Really, there's nothing negative for me to say here. This is one of the cleanest fights FromSoft have ever done gameplay wise, and the arena with the black sky is amazing too. This boss is the essence of Dark Souls 3 combat. He's simple, he's clean, and he will whoop your ass. FromSoft have done a lot of reused bosses, and most fucking suck, let's be real. So this is another rehash of Ornstein, and obviously I fucking love it. What? When have I ever hated rehashes? What are you talking about? Okay, I get what you're saying, just hear me out for a second. Does he really play that similar to Ornstein? To me, the most defining feature of this fight are his long shield combos, which not only can I not think of a boss before I'm having it, I can't think of an enemy having it. It makes the fight incredibly dynamic because you actually have to pay attention to two of his hands even though he's wielding weapon and shield. This is a fight that plays incredibly well, only brought down by you being able to fall off the arena, though the arena does look fucking awesome with the butterflies in the background as well, and the fact that it's once again Ornstein. But then again, the idea that this world is so broken that the only thing it can throw at you is an empty armor has a lot of charm too. This was my first reaction to this fight. Fucking shit game. One of the worst games I've ever played. Shit game. That did not hit me. I don't like this boss. I really don't. What's salt? In all seriousness, there's no salt here. It just feels like a really boring boss fight of roll once, hit once, roll once, hit once, roll once, hit once. What's salt? In all seriousness, there's no salt here. Now, before you shoot, I will admit I've come around to it. At least, somewhat. One thing I haven't changed my mind on is my issue with the second phase. As long as you keep close and use the pillars correctly, the second phase is just the first phase again with a second health bar, as Lothric himself doesn't really use ranged attacks very often, if at all, if you play that way. However, what I've changed my opinion on is how fun the first phase is. Part of that was just camera, which I've gotten better with. He's a unique kind of aggressive with his teleport, which initially seemed like a lame way to achieve aggressiveness and just took me a while to fully appreciate. I'm still not fully on board with it because of the previously mentioned point, but I honestly can't deny that it's a super fun fight and super intense any longer. No guys, calm down. This is not another fucked up Dragon Ball. It's not. It's really not. Because this is a wyvern, not a dragon. They're totally different. Completely different. This is a boss that consists of running past a bunch of enemies, including Chain Guy, who is the real boss of this fucking thing, and then jumping on the dragon's head and one-shotting him. If you try to fight him normally, it's a tedious battle of attrition, so just do that, get it over with, move on, forget this boss ever existed, and my god, please never do this again. Funnily enough, we go from something that looks like a dragon but doesn't play like one, to something that doesn't look like a dragon but at least plays like one. And I am speaking about the first phase of the Nameless King, the King of the Storm. I honestly think this one plays quite decently. It has a nice varied range of in-air attacks and on-the-ground attacks. Although I do think that his fire breath is too easily punished and often the fight just comes down to waiting for that. But let's get into the real meat and potatoes here, the Nameless King himself. Funnily enough, you wouldn't think that this late into the overall Souls & Co series there would be another boss which would be a blueprint for what's to come, but this one actually is. This is the first time we really see weirdly delayed attacks. This is one of the few bosses in Dark Souls 3 which isn't a pure dodge fest, because you have to actually time your dodges, which is something that Elden Ring would use extensively. In addition to that, one of my favorite things about this fight is how he sometimes moves away from you and then comes right back. It gives the fight a really dynamic feeling where you're not just standing in front of each other all the time. In addition to that, he has some really cool lightning attacks, like the one where he throws lightning into the air and you have to time it with his cast. And obviously the arena is fucking epic, though this is another case of me having some trouble with depth perception. But it's not as bad here as say with the Four Kings. All in all, the Nameless King isn't just a king name-wise, but also in terms of bosses. Plus, he whooped Asmongold's ass, and that gets an automatic plus for me.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I'm not gonna kill this boss, obviously.
How do you end a series like Dark Souls? A series that had so much impact upon the entire gaming industry that an entire genre was coined after it. Well, first let's look back and see what the previous titles did. Dark Souls 1 went for mostly an emotional final. Dark Souls 2 on the other hand tried to cover as many different areas as it could by having 3 back-to-back-to-back bosses, 1 duo boss and 2 singular bosses that played quite differently. Sadly, the 2 singular bosses were both garbage, but that's beside the point. So all Dark Souls 3 did was say, okay, let's do all that. The first phase is an amalgamation of different movesets that the boss switches between dynamically. It's a cool way to give a boss a lot of moves, but not have it be overwhelmingly much. And then in the second phase we bring back moves from Gwyn and add his theme to the music. It's a very safe and calculated way of ending Dark Souls. It's by no means bad, but at the same time it is kind of disappointing how rigid and how calculated it is and how little risks were taken here. I would have personally liked them to take a huge risk and do something completely out of the box, but they went with the safe option and I can understand why they did it. Honestly, I will defend the Ashes of Ariandel DLC as still a solid DLC. However, this boss is not the reason why. Let's ignore the NPC since it's an NPC with a slightly unique weapon. The wolf comes in when the NPC is basically dead, so it's really just a 1v1 with the wolf. So what does the wolf have to offer? He's got no sword in his mouth, so that's disappointing. He's a more refined version of Royal Rat Authority. Okay, can we just move on? I will defend the Ashes of Ariandel DLC as still a solid DLC, and this boss is a lot of the reason why. Oh, the chills the intro gives. Oh, the intensity you feel when she first turns invisible. Honestly, the first phase is everything Priscilla ever wanted to be and more. Way more. It's amazing. So then comes phase 2. First phase wasn't too hard because of her low health. So what have we got? Well, we have maybe the best double boss that doesn't follow the classic Ornstein and Smoke formula to this point. Yeah, that's pretty good, I would say. It has a good mix of aggressiveness, ranged attacks and spacing. And honestly, it manages it without any real cover. It's really impressive stuff that this double boss works this well. But it's a shame. It's really a shame that the DLC was so short. I wish there was more. And then FromSoft dumps on you the single best boss phase the world has ever seen. Phase 1 was amazing, this is phase 1 on crack, and 3 has swallowed an all-consuming void. This is one of the most stunning things I've ever experienced in video gaming to this day, and I'll pay another $20 just for a single boss phase that's as good as Black Flame Freedom. Take all my money and just give me more of this, please. Really. This singular phase would be enough to save the entire DLC. That's how good it is. So that was a fucking lie. I personally thought the old Demon King was a great way to cap off the demon storyline, so when the Demon Prince came around I wasn't particularly thrilled. The initial phase with the 2 bad demons has a neat idea where one is active and actively pursuing you, where the other one only supports with like poison ranged attacks. However, that quickly gets repetitive when you realize they have like 3 attacks each. So the main course here is the second phase, where depending on who you kill first in Ornstein and Smoke style, the other one gets to be the Demon Prince. And now we finally have a proper fight. The Demon Prince is aggressive, has a bunch of flashy attacks, and can make your life hell. So while initially I wasn't too thrilled, in the end it ended up being quite decent. They have done it. It may have taken 47 years, but we're finally here at a good dragon boss. No more dragon with no attacks in the air, no more dragon that has only 3 attacks, no more dragon that can just go fuck itself, to be honest, and no more dragon that's miniature, and certainly no more dragon that is actually a wyvern and sucks and is just a gimmick and a one-shot and fuck you. This is a big guy and he will whoop your ass in a multitude of ways. One great thing about this boss is that it encourages you to fight the dragon head on instead of under him. The damage you do to other parts of his body is minuscule, so you actually fight him front on. Additionally, I mean, the arena is great, he looks great, and then eventually he just fires a laser at you. I mean, what the fuck more could you want? It's pretty much everything I ever wanted them to do with a dragon boss. It's near perfect. The name Half-Light makes sense, as the developers probably didn't see well when designing this NPC. I mean, I get it. Okay, it's the final DLC of the trilogy, so you want to do one final PvP side boss. I get it. I didn't get to try out the PvP aspect of it, so I can't judge that. But please, for the love of God, make the NPC that replaces it in the offline mode at least somewhat fun to fight. He's just ridiculous. He dishes out more damage than Meteor, while having a stupid ass moveset that is just not fun to fight. Just, my god, it's not that difficult. You could have plugged any NPC in there and it would have been better. Finally, after years of rigorous testing and extensive research, FromSoft think they have managed to create it. The perfect final boss. Oh look, it's Artorias again! Okay, I'm kidding. Gale is an absolutely fantastic boss, and a much better send-off than Soul of Cinder, who wasn't bad, mind you. This is another one that you could argue is a mix of everything, but it's a mix that has character. From obvious things like the honestly pretty funny crossbow spam and his delayed cape attacks, to less obvious things like certain somewhat unique combos, this boss is still its own thing. He's not a rehash of Artorias, that was a joke. I want to make that abundantly clear. He also has one of the best boss arenas in FromSoft history, not only a nice open area to play with, but also an Alondo and Lothric in the background gives this whole thing a lot of character and really integrates it into the game. This is the time to finally give a true 07 to the Dark Souls series, with this incredible beast of a man. Well, until Dark Souls 4 comes out. They renamed it to Elden Ring, but let's be honest, but 07 nonetheless. Dark Souls 3 played it very safe with a lot of their bosses, and you can criticize that and I'll be there with you. However, at least there's a trade-off here. The bosses on the other hand have never been this polished. There's very few dots considering the decent amount of bosses in the game, and there's a ton of just stupidly good bosses that even when we're fighting them a couple times don't get boring at all. So while I would have liked them to take a few more creative liberties, I really can't argue with the result. Moving on, the next game is Sekiro. I considered not even talking about this game because I think it's very different from the other ones, but I did it anyway because talking about FromSoft games in a video and not talking about Sekiro seems weird. Technically I only did one full playthrough of Sekiro, although I did go back and fight all the bosses again through the Reflections of Strength feature, and there really isn't such a thing as a Sekiro build anyway, if we're being honest. Obviously I didn't use summons again as the Anon, I also refrained from using any gimmicks really, but it is worth mentioning that I barely used the gadgets and mostly just used my fucking sword. The Shura ending with its boss I did simply by backing up my save beforehand, and I think that's all there is to say here. Let's get going. If this was a list about how close a boss's name is to Gyobo Masataka Oniwa, this boss would be fairly close to the top. Sadly it's not. That doesn't mean it's bad though. This is the first boss most people will encounter playing Sekiro, and it's a pretty weird one when you consider the entire context of the game. The first boss normally is supposed to introduce you to the game. In Sekiro, however, the mini-bosses do that job, and the first boss is something that's entirely different from anything else in the game. The main issue you run into with Gyobo is that, while the presentation is nice, the mini-bosses you'll encounter before him likely gave you more trouble than he himself. He's just a guy on a horse. What I mean by that is, The horse doesn't do anything particular, so in the end you're just fighting a guy with a weapon again. This is a cool boss and presentation, an idea, but I feel like they could have done more with it.
Papillon.
Butterfly.
Farfalla.
Mariposa.
And here we arrive at what should have been the first boss, and admittedly she can be depending on the direction you take initially. Lady Butterfly is the personification of the butterfly in German meme. As despite her name, she will pummel, snipe, kick you and rip your fucking head off. She's aggressive, fast and unrelenting, but the real key here is that this fight wants you to be just as aggressive, fast and unrelenting, which is made apparent by the fact that if you really throw yourself at her, you can thrash her in about 20 seconds. Her second phase only really has the added illusions, which, fairly speaking, suck. Either you use a non-renewing consumable every time she does it, in which case this phase is the same as phase 1, only a bit drawn out, or you could run around for a minute with practically zero danger, and this phase is the same as phase 1, only really drawn out. This is just dragging out content without really adding anything to the gameplay, and sadly brings the fight down a bit. Still, she is a great teaching tool and a great boss. The truest one-on-one Miyazaki has ever created. This one really feels like two equal warriors clashing. Only one of them is bitch made and has to rely on hocus pocus magic halfway around. But I digress. This is Mikiri Heaven and in some ways the true Sekiro experience. While there are better bosses in this game, this one feels like the most Sekiro type boss there is. The entire fight is a dance, where you try to get the relationship to become more intimate by removing the sword that is putting distance between you and Genichiro. Don't forget to back off, blushing of course and denying you ever liked him. Just a really well done fight, and the first time Sekiro shows that its combat style has just as much potential as anything that came before it. The folding screen monkeys are a puzzle boss, and you know, I don't fundamentally hate the idea of puzzle bosses, and the invisible monkey is actually quite neat once you realize it. Only, for one, please don't make it just a puzzle. If this fight, quote unquote, had any sort of difficulty, it might be interesting, but you really need to have a death wish to actually die here. And secondly, don't make it so you can just ignore most of the puzzle. I mean, sure, you can use the towers that help with each monkey or the bell, or you could just chase after them for 5 minutes and just catch them. In some ways it's cool that that's an option, but in other ways it just makes the whole thing pointless. While the focus on parries and deflects is certainly the most glaring difference between Sekiro and other Souls games, there's another difference that could have been just as big: the movement. Not only are you stupidly fast compared to the other games, you also have way more movement options in grapple, jumping, wall jumps and so on. So I find it a bit of a shame not more bosses do what Guardian Ape does and make use of the extended movement. This monkey is dynamic, fast, and the fight uses the whole arena to its advantage, including grappling points both on and off the monkey. Some attacks you have to run away, some you can play like any other Sekiro boss. This is maybe the most varied fight in the entire game in terms of the possible and expected responses. Oh, and then he uses his sliced off head to scream you into oblivion just after you took a deep breath. His animations in the second phase are really unsettling and still creep me out. This is another second phase that is really easy once you calmly look at what's going on, and that is perfect for a fight that just scared the shit out of you but not being over. Monkey is good. Return to monkey. Two monkeys is less good. I return from returning to monkey. Dual fights in these games were always hard to do well, and Sekiro's focus on one-on-ones makes them even worse here. This combat style is not designed for you to juggle two opponents, especially with zero cover. The first phase is the exact same as the Guardian Ape's second, and the second phase is just both phases at once. It just becomes a waiting game of running around until one decides to open him or herself up for a hit or two. This is just a drawn out affair that doesn't even add anything new. And that right after you fought the Guardian Ape. It's truly a baffling decision that this was even included in the game. The first time you encounter the corrupted monk, it's a weak version of it, which you can pretty much just kill with a couple of snap seeds. That has a mini boss in front of it called Orin of the Water, which is 10 times more interesting than itself. This is another boss that feels like it was just put in the game, so it doesn't have that few bosses. There's really no point to it, considering you fight a stronger version of it 5 minutes later. Sekiro does something unique amongst all FromSoft games, in which you get to choose a path. You can either help your father, which according to all you know at this point is the incarnation of evil, or you could do the sensible thing. Condolences to whoever chose the first option on the first playthrough without knowing what would happen, but whoever chose the second gets to fight their father, which sounds like an epic battle until you realize all he does is keep you away. He has poison that forces you to keep distance, he has a bomb that doesn't allow you to use consumables anymore, so you gotta keep your distance there. He jumps away, he dodges, he does firework where you also gotta keep your distance. Everything he does is just to keep you away. I get that it's basically an old guy trying to use whatever he has, but it's just not a fun fight. It's tedious, it's long, all while being not particularly difficult. And here we have the full corrupted monk fight. Now, this is a decent fight, but does anyone look at this fight and say, this one really needs to be in the game twice? The first phase is basically the same as the first fight a couple minutes ago, only now you actually have to fight it and can't snapseed your way through it. It has some nice and long combos that really feel satisfying to block, so it's definitely not bad, but it does feel more like a mini-boss. The second phase you can just skip entirely with a one-shot attack, and in the third phase you gain some terror attacks, which also don't add much. You really have to try to die by terror, to actually die by terror, with how easy that stuff is to dodge in the third phase. Normally I wouldn't be too harsh on a reuse like that, it's not the worst, but considering the small amount of bosses Sekiro has, it's just disappointing how many reuse bosses there are. Thankfully, the second version of him is much more aggressive, and as a result, this is the fight that Owl was truly meant to deliver. This actually feels like a fight of two shinobi. He uses all the tools, but actually uses them to attack, not to run away. Wouldn't you have known that was possible? One of the coolest additions, by the way, is that he can Mikiri counter you. That's just fucking awesome. My favorite move of the entire fight is when he conceals his attacks with the fireworks. It's a really nice touch. His second phase is a neat twist where you have to mentally keep track of where the owl flies, but it's not actually a two-person fight. This is the best way, honestly, how you can pull a fight off in Sekiro, where you have to pay attention to two entities. My only issue with it is, again, it's another repeat fight in a short game with not a lot of fights in the first place. But apart from that, masterfully done. This one deserves the title of Great Shinobi after all. Alright, so the lore could be the best of any From Software game ever. The first phase is garbage anyway, so let's ignore it and move on to the main treat, the dragon itself. As they've learned with media how to make a great dragon fight, this one is great too. Sure, it's a gimmick fight and not really a dragon fight gameplay wise, but the spectacle is great. And I mean the gameplay isn't too... okay, sorry, this hurts me physically, I can't go on like this. The gameplay is absolutely awful. The dragon has like 3 attacks. You run up to the branches and click the press here to win button to do huge damage, rinse, repeat, with the only danger coming from if you're unlucky and he does his wind blast just as you enter the lightning, in which case, surprise, you're dead! And have to start from the beginning again. Sure, it's a spectacle. You know, I thought the Bed of Chaos was a great visual spectacle too. It's not nearly as bad as bitch slapping a turd to end it, but still, fuck this fight on almost all fronts. After all this build-up about the Divine Dragon, this is what you deliver. A 3-attack run at the enemy boss with a terrible first phase as well. Just get the fuck out. Compared to the other Souls games, Sekiro has a very limited amount of bosses, so it's nice that at the end of the game it at the very least gives you that one extra final challenge for those who want it. The Demon of Hatred is that challenge, and honestly he's aptly named, because apparently he incites a lot of hate in people. However, I can understand that. I love this boss. I absolutely adore this boss. So for one, like the Guardian Ape, it actually takes advantage of the movements that you get in Sekiro compared to other Souls games. Secondly, he's very dynamic. People say that he's not a Sekiro boss because you can't block him. There are plenty of his attacks that you can block. Just need to be clear on which you should avoid and which you should block. You can still block the other ones, just not fully. So this is the one boss that actually adds another option of dodging attacks compared to blocking them. Now, one problem people have with this fight is that it's long, and it is on the longer side, no doubt, but people miss how many openings this boss gives you. Almost at any point where you're close to him, you can attack him. Like, this boss is very open, so you can just beat down on him. It's a very dynamic and fun fight that never really takes a break, and ramps up nicely from phase 1 to 2 and phase 2 to 3 slowly in intensity. It is a very well done fight and the perfect conclusion for people that want an extra challenge. Okay, Genichiro isn't that bad, but let's ignore him and instead look at this fucking cutscene. Like, holy shit, there's a guy coming out of this guy's neck and he has a fucking Glock 18. The biggest revelation of this fight is that Ishin is American, because I don't think a newborn can get a Glock 18 in Japan. This fight is a mix of a lot of stuff you've experienced over the course of the game, except the movement aspect, which falls by the wayside. Genichiro is similar as you know, and Ishin's first phase here isn't all too different from the other Ishin's first phase. But then you have two new phases, which feel like they have nothing to do with the previous ones gameplay wise. That's fine, I guess. The main difficulty in these two phases comes from you not seeing what he's doing, thanks to the grass obscuring it. Apart from that, if you fought some of the mini-bosses before, this entire fight is mostly just a chain of mini-bosses and bosses you know, with a gun and lightning thrown in for good measure. It's not a bad way to finish off a game, and like mentioned, has one of the most memorable cutscenes FromSoft have ever done, but overall it's actually kind of underwhelming in that it's just a rehash. The arena and atmosphere is great, but like mentioned, they bring their own issues with them, and overall it's one of the easier fights in the late game, so they definitely could have done more here. Don't take these criticisms the wrong way though, this is still an amazing fight, and it's critique on a high level. It's a great way to finish off a great game. I just prefer the other Ishin. Don't kill me. Yes, you heard that right, I prefer this Ishin. Ignoring that you miss a third of the game and can't go back, so you can really fuck up your save file if you don't know, I think this is a really cool and unique addition. First off, Emma is a better first phase than Genichiro, let's just put that out there. The entire fight also manages to feel final and really hammers home that you're an idiot for the choice you've made. It especially hammers it home when Emma twirls her arms, lunges across the entire arena with an insane delay and almost insta-kills you. It hammers it home even more when Ishin does the exact same thing. Fuck that grab. This is one of the hardest fights for me purely off that one attack. I cannot avoid it for the life of me. Aside from that though, this fight is great. The first phase of Ishin is actually better than the first phase of Swords and Ishin, with dodges and some other slight adjustments and weird timings that really throw you off. Very well done. And the second phase adds fire, which fire always makes things cooler, and actually builds upon the first phase and doesn't just do something completely different Swords and Ishin. Anyway, fuck those scraps, seriously. While I do have more issues with Sekiro than some other people and don't rate it as high, the bosses actually aren't one of the reasons. The only big issue I have with the bosses is how many reuses there are in a game with only 14 bosses. Apart from that, the quality of them is actually pretty damn good. Lastly, we come on to Elden Ring. Now this is a very different game in terms of structure. I cannot talk about every boss here. The video will take forever. Obviously I've already skipped the chalice bosses in Bloodborne as well as the mini bosses and the boss rush variants in Sekiro. so it's not like it's truly every boss anyway. So let's try to find a good metric by what constitutes a boss to talk about in a video like that in Elden Ring. I didn't just wanna arbitrarily choose which bosses I take for this video, and a lot of very direct ways of picking them end up with too few or too many bosses. For example, taking only the Remembrance bosses leaves very few bosses for a game as huge as Elden Ring, and taking any boss that the game refers to as great enemy or better would result in me talking about every single dragon individually, so neither of those work. The simple one I've come up with is I'm gonna take the achievements. Every boss that has an achievement will be talked about. In addition, the final 2 bosses don't have an achievement, obviously I gotta talk about those. In addition to those 32 bosses that fit these criteria, I allowed myself to talk about 5 more that I just wanted to talk about. This leaves us with 37 bosses to talk about in Elden Ring, which is still less than Dark Souls 2, which really makes you realize how stupidly many bosses Dark Souls 2 had, but I digress. Now this is based on 3 playthroughs of Elden Ring. In my first playthrough I tried a bunch of different builds. I started out with a club, then a grey club, then the golden halberd. I went for a faith build midway through using the winged scythe, using 2 scythes. I tried a bunch of other shit too, like using a rapier, a twin blade, claws, a katana, and in the end I finished off the game with the Hand of Millennia. My second playthrough is actually not finished, it's a level 1 playthrough. I am like 2/3 of the way done, but I am trying to do every boss, and I mean every boss, meaning every entity in the game that has an enemy felt screen or more, so that is taking a while. Here I went simply for a status effect build where I used 2 rapiers to inflict frost, bleed and scarlet rot. All that's left is the playthrough I did for this video. So obviously I gotta pick the wretch, as that's the only class in the game if we're being honest. And then for once I spent a long time modeling this character after myself. I really wanted to personify how I would look in this world. This took hours and I hope you appreciate the effort. All that's left is to give myself an appropriate name. And we're off. To honor George R.R. Martin, I went for the Game of Thrones sword for the pretty much entire playthrough, and therefore went for a strength build. Although I did limit myself not only in the total level I would go to, which is 25 less than my first playthrough, but also in the amount of strength I would put in, because I didn't want to kill the bosses too quickly. Lastly, I didn't use summons or spirit summons for any of these 3 playthroughs in combat. Oh, and also in the playthrough I did for this video, I obviously went for the best ending, so don't you worry. So with that, I think we're ready. Let's get going for the last time. Okay, I know I just mentioned my criteria and the first boss is already an exception, but this one I think is very justified, because let's be real, this is more of a boss than most actual bosses by any metric other than the end screen. There are articles written about how much people got stuck on this one. There were competitions held for how fast you can beat this one. You could actually argue that the Tree Sentinel has become the most iconic boss of the entire game. So I think it would be a disservice not to talk about him. This is one of the bosses that are designed as a roadblock. They're designed to make you go around him and come back later. However, who actually does that? This is why I play Souls games, so I'm not gonna move around him obviously. This is one of the few places where I think they reused some Sekiro stuff. Some of the animations are similar to Gyobo, but unlike Gyobo, this one plays far more dynamically. He moves around on his horse, he can slam you with his horse, he can jump. This is everything I want from a horse-based boss. His design is iconic. The switch up to the second phase is perfect, because what a lot of people end up doing is stick to his shield side, because in his first phase he doesn't have many attacks there. Or good fucking luck, because the most dangerous attacks in phase 2 come from his shield side. This is maybe the best boss FromSoft have ever done for the purpose of telling the player, your hand is not gonna be held. There are dragons in Elden Ring. There's a bunch of dragons in Elden Ring. It makes no sense for me to talk about all of them by themselves, so I'm gonna group most dragons into one and have Flying Dragon Agiel represent them all, as he's most likely the one you'll encounter first. Dragons that are of what I'm gonna call Agiel's type are very directly based on Midir. It's very clear that that is the baseline that FromSoft worked off of. However, they did make him a lot more dynamic in terms of how much he flies, how much air attacks he has, and how much he moves around. And the main reason they did that is to enable the horse. And I love that. There are plenty of ways to fight these dragons. You can fight them head on, you can fight them under them, you can use your horse, you cannot use your horse. You can partially use your horse and then get off the horse to attack him. And that last one is what I really love. Because you summon your horse, it feels really cool when fighting a dragon to just get off and on dynamically. It's a really cool feeling. And while I do agree that there's probably a bit too many of them, I do feel like they kept it fresh mostly throughout. They gave him some new attacks, they gave him different elements, and honestly I like the dragon bosses. The game would definitely be worse without them. They fill an important role in the game and give the world a lot more character. Finally we arrive at what I think most people would agree to be one of the big bosses of Elden Ring, Margit the Fell Omen. And remember when I said that the Nameless King was a blueprint because of how he delays his attacks? Look at this shit! Sometimes he delays his attacks so much he doesn't even attack! Wait, what? Excuse me? In some ways this boss is the tutorial boss of Elden Ring. He's the one that actually teaches you what's about to come your way. He's perfect for practicing parrying, and like I said, he's the first time you really see super long delayed attacks. Additionally, he tells you, go somewhere else if he's too hard. Well, obviously I didn't do that. I banged my head against the wall until it gave in, but you can go somewhere else and level up some. I quite like the idea that he summons weapons in his offhand. Similar to the Soul of Cinder, this gives him a large amount of moves without it being an overwhelming amount of moves at any point in time. He's a great boss overall, but only the start of what's about to come. Most people's first Shardbearer is Godric the Grafted in Stormveil Castle, and if there's anything this boss should be known for, it's for the most savage voice line FromSoft have ever given a boss. In your quest to prove that you are fit to be grafted, you will have to take a trip to Combo Town. Here we have normal combos, combos with white lines in the air, AoE combos, ranged combos, twirling through the air combos. The first phase of this boss is just about learning the bunch of combos this boss has. Once you have them down, this boss is a cakewalk. And then he puts a dragon on his arm, because why the fuck not? The second phase is another example of just staying calm. The dragon actually makes him more vulnerable. He has so many attacks where he's just totally open and free to attack, and all you need to do is recognize that and go for it. This is still early in the game, and so this boss is kind of a teaching tool to tell you, just stay calm, analyze what's actually going on, and then you'll probably have no issue. All in all, the most handsome man FromSoft have ever created is a pretty damn good boss. The Weeping Peninsula is a pretty big area, at the end of which you'll find Castlemont, which has had seen better days. This is a pretty neat and big dungeon, at the end of which you would expect a major boss. Instead you'll get the Leonine Misbegotten. Even at the beginning this feels like a mini-boss. And wouldn't you know, it kind of is? The whole point of this is supposed to be that you get the Grafter Blade Greatsword from him, which then begs the question, why doesn't he use it? The wiki even says he uses it, but look at it, does that look like he actually uses the Iron Throne as a sword? Because to me it doesn't, and I don't understand why. It's a fine boss by itself, but as the final boss and the main boss of the entire Weeping Peninsula, this is just a weak boss in that context. It should have been somewhere else. If I had a nickel for every time I've seen a wolf boss with a blade in its mouth, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Unlike its cousin with white fur though, this one decided to spec into intelligence, so he's a mage wolf. Right. I honestly quite like this fight. It has a lot of energy. The wolf behaves like a wolf. He bites, he jumps around, he uses magic. Yeah, just like a wolf, right. There are some issues with this boss however. For one, even for early on, this health pool is abysmally small. You can just rush him down pretty easily. In addition, his moveset, while varied between blade, magic and bite attacks, isn't actually that big and gets repetitive fairly quickly. I also feel that some of his attacks, especially some of his spider attacks, could have used a quarter of a second more telegraphing. But honestly, all that would only be a problem if he would be a major boss, which he isn't, so he's still a pretty good boss. What is a major boss is Renala of the Full Moon. When you first encounter this boss, it feels like out of a weird horror movie, with all the scholars crawling around and biting you from the floor. While the gameplay in this first phase isn't particularly thrilling, the atmosphere is pretty unique. The real highlight though here is the second phase, where we go just full on Disney, and this is a mage boss, a full on mage boss, which is pretty cool, we lacked those. She has a wide range of attacks and can even turn into the fucking moon, which I guess explains her title. My main issue with this fight, however, is that most of the danger doesn't come from her, but from the enemies she summons. It's nice that they don't stay for long, so it's dynamic, but I really would have preferred for her to be more active and for the summons to be less active in this fight. In addition, why didn't you place a Stake of America right outside her arena? It's not like there's any danger on the way to her. It's just a waste of time to have to walk over there each time. Still an improvement from the boss runs in the previous games. But it was still unnecessary. I love that we're finally getting our fill of mage bosses in Elden Ring. I also love that there's more than just one horse boss. What I don't love is that a boss way later in the game than the Tree Sentinel is way weaker than the Tree Sentinel. What the fuck is this? The idea of a horse riding mage boss is honestly quite thrilling, but the execution just isn't it. The range of spells are very limited and mostly just come down to simple projectiles, and their melee attacks are really weak. They could have really done way more with this one. One boss you'll encounter multiple times throughout the game is the Dragonkin Soldier, and while everyone's favorite instance is in the Lake of Rot, the one I'm gonna talk about is the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella. While this one is stats-wise actually the weakest, it's the one with the most advanced moveset and the most fun moveset. The Dragonkin Soldier in general is kind of what Volnir tried to be without the gimmick, and it's not a bad execution. However, one problem with the normal one is that you can just trap yourself between his legs and he can't really get you out of there and you can just slash away. This one has a couple of moves that get you out of there. Especially the ones where he just jumps up in the air and throws frozen lightning at you. Wait, what the fuck is going on? This is a fucking cool boss! He flies around the fucking arena throwing frozen lightning at you. He's flashy, he's fast, he moves a lot. Honestly, this kind of feels like a dragon fight. You fight under him, he flies around, he's big, he can stomp you. My main issue with this boss is that sometimes it's really hard to tell what he's doing when you fight under him. But other than that, even his entrance is epic, so this one has my approval, honestly. Moving on to another fight that's kind of a dragon fight, if you wanna get to the Altus Plateau, one option is through the ruin-strewn precipice, where you'll find Magma Vermakar. And you heard that right, this guy is technically a dragon. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. This is Lawrence without any of the cool things about Lawrence. He throws magma everywhere and he's very slow to attack. The main danger here is his charge. The fight does get more interesting in the second phase where he stands on his hind legs and uses his sword more. However, for most of that second phase you'll just be staring at his chode. It's hard to tell what exactly he's doing while doing that, and it's not exactly thrilling either. I wouldn't call it a bad boss as it does have some uniqueness to it, but I don't love fighting it. It feels like a very long and drawn out fight that isn't particularly fun either. Any efforts to recreate Giga Chat in the character creation were futile, because nothing you could ever do there can match this absolute terror chat of a unit. This is a man so far above everyone else that even though his brain is rotten mush, even though he hasn't had anything to eat except carcasses for seemingly centuries, even though he has to use his own magic constantly to stay on his horse, he can't even sit down properly, they still hold festivals to get the best warriors to come to finally take him down. The setup for this fight is brilliant. This is one of the most epic settings FromSoft have ever managed to create. One thing that is really understated about this fight is how the part before that also sets the tone. When you get to Redmane Castle, whether through teleporting or through walking there, it is a barren place, it is run down, there are corpses hanging everywhere, the only enemies you will really find are two lions with blades for feet. The music is fantastic, it's simple, but my god does it set the atmosphere. And I haven't even touched that. Even before that, you have this thing being built up by people like Alexander. Now when it comes to the actual fight, it plays fantastically. This guy is massive, but he still telegraphs all his moves with his entire body, so even though you're below him often when you fight in melee and don't see much, you still can tell what he's gonna do next. But even when you know what he's gonna do, he still might fuck your shit up. And if you manage to get past that, he comes down as a fucking meteor. The real icing on the cake is Leonard, the horse. Anyone that doesn't think that this horse adds a lot of character to this boss can fuck right off. This is easily best horse in video gaming history. Roach doesn't even compare. And after saying all that, I haven't even touched on the unique summon mechanic for this fight, the amazing looking sand dune arena. The only negative thing I can add is that when fighting him without the summons, running up to him with horse or without is kind of tedious, but it's just part of the boss being designed around the summons, so that's not a huge deal. There's also something very interesting going on in his last phase, where he summons the meteors, but the meteors don't actually do anything for most of the fight. I've seen plenty of people go through the entire phase without the meteors ever unleashing, which they only do on one specific attack. But just them being there gives the fight this air of uncertainty because you don't know what new is gonna happen. It's really brilliantly done because there wasn't too much room in this fight to add many more attacks, but without doing that, they still managed to change quite a bit about it. I'm gonna stop gushing now because we have to move forward. There are other bosses we need to get to, and at this rate we won't get to them. I take back everything I've said about Radahn and move it over to this boss. Now just take a look at this Giga Chad of a boss. I mean, look at the chin, look at the statue, look at the weapon choice. It's just perfect. Like, I can't imagine anyone having better taste in a build than this boss. Like, it's truly marvelous. I never imagined someone could have the creativity to come up with a character like this. I mean, where do you even come up with it? It's clearly not stolen from anywhere. It's just pure unbridled creativity. In addition to skill in building a character that is unseen before on this earth. Truly marvelous. Whoever came up with this thing deserves to design every boss from FromSoft from this point onwards. A fucking masterclass. I love the Sea of River. It's one of my favorite areas in the game, so it should come as no surprise that I also quite like the Ancestor Spirit. This moose, which they've had to resort to, because let's be real, the only other option here would have been a giant lobster, and that was already used. Anyway, this moose is fairly simple. It's a fairly easy boss with only a couple of attacks. However, that's not the point here. The point here is the atmosphere. This boss has probably my favorite OST in the entire game. That plus the arena give it a really serene vibe. In addition to that, the animations of this boss are really fantastic. I especially love the animation of him jumping in the air. It looks almost majestic, and that's the entire point of this fight. You are killing something here that's worshipped by the people that you just fought. Why are you doing this? What's the point? This is one of the few really short fights in the entire game, actually more like the entire From Software catalog, that is still very memorable. And it's actually perfect that it's short and fairly early on, because, moving on, the next boss we'll get to is the Regal Ancestor Spirit. This is, I guess you could say, a reuse. However, keep in mind, Elden Ring is a much different game than the other games. It's much longer and it has a completely different structure. I encountered the Regal Ancestor Spirit about 80 hours after the Ancestor Spirit, so I was not only completely fine with reusing the boss, I was happy to see it again, because it was a great boss. And not only that, they one-upped it. The one thing that's really cool that they gave it are the animals in the room, the other spirit animals. Not only can it teleport to them, it then gains an additional attack based on which animal it came out of. That's super cool. And then its ability to kill the spirit animals around it to regain its health. It's a really weird and stunning moment the first time you see it. My only real complaint here is that it can use the healing move up to 3 times. That's too much. The fight can really drag due to that, but honestly, if there's any fight I don't mind dragging, it might be this one. Oh hey, it's the gargoyles. Yeah, this is definitely a callback to Dark Souls 1, which is pretty neat. That's the only really neat thing about this boss though. This one doesn't work. So why does this duo boss not work while the Bear Gargoyles do? They're fairly similar. One comes in when the one is at half health, they both have melee attacks and an area control attack, and kind of switch between focusing on one or the other. So for starters, the poison here is absolutely stupid. Why does this poison hurt you more than any fire? Walking through magma hurts you less than this poison breath. And I'm not even talking about the poison effect. I'm just talking about the straight damage you get from being in it. Secondly, the area it covers is insane. Look at this. Especially when they do their breath forward, it goes in a cone that's so wide and so long, it covers so much ground, and it stays. And this is the key part. In the case of the Bear Gargoyles, the fire was only there when one actively breathed. In this case, the shit stays for a while. So you can have a case where both just put out poison, so there's a large area you have to avoid, and then both go in for melee attacks at the same time. In addition, while I actually like their moveset, for example the Black Blade Kindred I think is super fun to fight, it's way too complex and not adjusted for a duo fight. Sure, most of the time you have one focusing on breathing poison and the other melee attacking you, but the other one sometimes just comes in from range without any indication while you're focusing the one. In the case of the Bear Gargoyles, they had to move up to you. If you had distance between you and them, you knew the one wasn't gonna be able to melee attack you for a while. That's not the case here. In addition, the area is pretty wide and pretty open, but there's a surprising amount of jank in this fight. I don't know how that's even possible, but my god, they get stuck on fucking everything. The only redeeming thing about this fight is really that I do actually like their moveset by themselves. It just should never have been a duo boss. Never in a million years. When I did my level 1 run, one of the first bosses I went to was the full-grown falling star beast you find in Mount Gelmir. The reason for that simply was that I wanted its drops, the smithing stones it drops. When I went there, I had a pretty much non-upgraded weapon. I was level 1. You can imagine I did no damage. And I had no health. So this fight took a while. It took literal hours. But I can honestly say, I enjoyed it. So that's why I want to talk about this boss, because when I fight a boss for hours and it doesn't get boring, that's where I draw the line. This has to be at least a good boss. And I actually think it's a very good boss. Not only is he mobile and he has a lot of attacks, a lot of very different attacks. From jumping in the air, from charges, from beams, from gravity attacks, from spikes under you that you have to time. Everything you could ever want, he has. And they're all telegraphed super well. Every attack has a completely different telegraphing, and it's very clear to tell what is coming. This makes the fight supremely smooth whenever you fight it. It's completely about you not making any mistakes and just keeping concentration up. Plus the lore behind it is pretty cool, with the Falling Star Beast evolving into the full-grown Falling Star Beast, evolving into this thing, and then evolving once more later on. As a side note, in my first Elden Ring run, after I beat him, I went to the wiki to look something up, and I saw that it said that its gravity attack, where it pulls you up in the air and slams you down, is not dodgeable. So I just want to gloat that I'm not the worst Elden Ring player out there. I'm at least better than whoever wrote this guide. That's a win in my book, let's go. It might be a very algorithmic fight and he might have a bit too much health, we can argue about that, but honestly, I really enjoy this fight. A boss I quite like is the Godskin Apostle. He's the second best Gomu Gomu no Mi user out there. However, if he ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi, then the Godskin Noble ate the Fat no Mi. Because this guy's fat. Also, did you know he had a tail? Because I didn't until recently. And what the fuck is that? You learn something new you didn't wanna know every day. Isn't that lovely? However, back to topic. The Godskin Noble is actually a pretty neat boss. He has some of the weirdest delays I see in the entire game, and that's saying a lot, because we have fucking Margit over here doing this shit. In addition, in the second phase he becomes even fatter and tries to butt slam you and roll against you. So that's pretty cool, I guess. However, I do struggle with some of his combos. Maybe I suck really badly, but I can't figure some of them out. In addition, some of his Black Flame attacks slow the fight down significantly, and the way he tries to punish you for healing by throwing a black ball at you, he's so slow with that you can just punish him instead, which is pretty stupid if you ask me. But other than that, pretty good boss with a pretty good OST. Next up is Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, and talking about this boss is pretty easy, because I don't have to think about a joke, he does that for me, his voice actor is fucking fantastic. And one of the most iconic things about the entire game. That aside, this boss arena is also fucking fantastic. This is one of the coolest boss arenas ever. Look at this, this is a painting, I would hang this up in my room, no problem. Moving on to the gameplay of this fight, this is a gimmick fight, using a weapon similar to the Stone Ruler. However, this one is done super extremely well. Why is it done well? Because it doesn't sacrifice the original gameplay for the gimmick. The sword has an entire moveset. You can jump attack with it, you can charge attack with it, it has a special. All they did was give you a weapon with a longer range. This makes the fight even more epic. It's a super cool idea. The fight itself is pretty simple and doesn't have a huge amount of attacks. However, it flows very well and some of its attacks are super cool. I especially love in Rykard's face the absolute madness that ensues midway through. It's fucking epic. And obviously the cutscene is goated, we don't even need to talk about that.
Join myself and King as remedy. Together we will devour the very god.
The way the entire snake just jumps at you sometimes is super cool and my god, I need to stop. This fight is fantastic. This is everything I ever wanted from a gimmick boss. It is absolutely brilliantly done and deserves all the praise. And here we have the final evolution of the Falling Star Beast, Astel, Natural Born of the Void. This boss looks super out of place, which is perfect because it is out of place. You can clearly tell how it evolved from the full-grown Falling Star Beast, and it has some really cool attacks. However, this one I actually have a bit more of an issue with gameplay wise, because at times this one does feel like a turn-based boss. He spends a lot of time between his attacks just idling around, and he also has a lot of attacks that force you to run away and slow the fight down considerably. Nonetheless, attacks like his teleport grab or his meteors are just super cool, and despite the gameplay being a bit lacking, the visuals kind of make up for it. Next up we have Elemer of the Briar, and this is a boss where they had a base moveset, a good melee moveset, and then thought, hey, we could give him a bunch of ranged attacks and then potentially have the fight ruined when the balance isn't right. And I mean, it's difficult to know in the first place what ranged attacks you would give a boss like that. Or we could make his sword fly. Yeah, it's pretty damn cool. The boss doesn't stand out particularly, but I really like the idea and it's well executed. That's all I have to say. It's a tale as old as time. So you finally got a new girlfriend. The first thing she obviously does is send you on an errand quest to give someone a dagger. Well, you don't really know who that is, but you find someone who does know, you give him that dagger, and you are a hero. Best boyfriend ever. Go back to your girlfriend, you find her standing over the dead body of that guy you just spoke to. Great! That's exactly what I wanted. Then she disappears with no reason and doesn't tell you where to go. So obviously you have to track her down. She has to have a good reason for what she does, right? So then you finally found her in a very nice place where everything is rotten and next to a body of a dead demigod. So that's perfectly normal. So then she sends you on another errand quest where you have to falsely be a boyfriend of another girl and then do a bunch of errands including killing a demigod, finding an ancient blade, then turning a tower upside down and fighting a fat guy to get what you need to go back to your girlfriend and give her that. And then she tells you she's gonna leave you for the dead guy next to her and have his child. And then she falls asleep, and when you touch her you have to fight an old ancient dragon. Now the redeeming thing about this whole thing is that the dragon fight is pretty fucking good. Not only does it not follow the basic blueprint the other dragons do, it has a mostly new moveset, it has some really cool moves. Like, really fucking cool moves. In addition to that, it has some really nice additions, like the lightning that's pretty much always on you and that you have to time. It's an additional thing you have to keep your eye on, but without it being overwhelming or too much. There's plenty of ways to fight this guy, and whatever the fuck is going on with this guy, I don't know, but it looks kind of weirdly cool, so that's a thing. So that's one of the best bosses you've ever fought. But back to the original story. where after you finally do that, you find the brother of the guy you gave the dagger to standing next to her, her dead, and him laughing. So the only thing you really got out of this whole charade is her child, which ends up being not a child but a rune. Ah, yes. A tale as old as time. Your goal in the beginning of the game is pretty obvious. Get to that big tree. It stands out a bit in the landscape, you know. One way of doing that is through that area where you find Lich Dragon Fortisax. There's a teleporter there that brings you to the capital. However, the far more common way of getting to the capital is just going to the capital. When you do that, you come across a slightly changed old friend, the Draconic Tree Sentinel. And honestly, this is a pretty good timing to add another notch to the Tree Sentinel. Just a moment before that, you had a moment where you could fight 2 Tree Sentinels. So this is pretty well timed. However, I feel like this very wise and old man said it best.
That's stupid. What you're doing is stupid. You're stupid! You're a stupid horse man, and I'm a real man!
Yeah, no, fuck this guy, fuck everything about him. Half the fight is him just spamming a fireball or the fucking lightning in the air. That's all he does for most of it. The Tree Sentinel was mobile, he moved around, he jumped around. This guy barely does that. When he moves around, he just does that to straight away do the fireball again. That's all he fucking does. In addition to that, he's just so slow. What's the point of an enemy on a horse if the only thing the horse does is spit a fireball? Just set him on a crab or something, that would be more interesting. Or a lobster. Oh, okay, I shudder at that thought, don't do that. But point still stands, this boss is absolute garbage. I hate it. Get it out of my sight. But at least the reward for beating that piece of shit is great. You finally get to go into the capital. It's a great dungeon. You finally get to explore a great nope, straight to the sewers with your bitch. You thought you were gonna explore a beautiful city. No. Here's the mandatory sewer level that every single video game out there has to have. Because at the end of this we find our next boss, Moke the Omen. And not to brag here, but I'm gonna have to keep this one quick, because honestly I beat him in record time. So the first time I fought him, I thought this is a cool boss. His attacks feel like they have a lot of weight, they flow very well, and he has some neat ranged attacks too that look kinda cool. However, it felt like there was a lot of untapped potential here, like you could have done a lot more with that. Like this is the basis for an even much greater boss.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
Anyway, good boss, moving on. And while we're on the topic of bosses that feel like the basis for something better, back to Leyndell we go to meet Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. And this one is somewhat disappointing. I mean, when you go into Leyndell, the obvious landmark aside from the Great Tree is actually that dome. I was expecting a great fight in there, instead I get this. It's a good fight, mind you, but it feels extremely simple. He only has some really basic axe swings and some stomps. That's his entire moveset. The first time I met him it was a first try, this time it was a first try. This is just a disappointing boss for such a big landmark, even though it doesn't fight badly. Honestly, at this point you might just call me the god of Elden Ring, because there's no player better than me. Let's just face it. This is the third boss in a row, where I'm gonna have to keep it quick, because I beat him first try and don't have a lot of footage. Okay, maybe I do have a bit of footage, so let's keep it not quite as short. Here we meet our old friend Margit, but this time he has leveled up. Not only in terms of his sword now being more glowy, but also his insides being more cursed. A lot of his timings and moves are quite different, and you have to kind of relearn Margit with an added layer on top. But where the fight gets really interesting is in phase 2. Not only is the ground now full of puke, which is great, but he's a lot more aggressive and in your face. He gets somewhat overwhelming in the second phase. It's great. This is another great reuse of a boss, honestly. I mean, they took something that was already quite good, put another layer of greatness on the top, and placed it content-wise far enough away from the original instance that it doesn't feel cheap. Not only that, but it's already hinted at in the first fight that this isn't the last time you're gonna see Margit, but you also meet him again in front of Artorias, where you can actually really kick his ass. So yeah, well done boss. It took me more than my first playthrough. On my first playthrough I actually thought this was a good boss, but didn't stand out in any way, but honestly I've come around to it. This boss is great. Now, before we go any further, it's time to do the most important quest in the entirety of Elden Ring. For that, we actually have to go back and get the bell to summon spirits with, which, yes, I haven't picked that up until this point, and then do this.
You promised me when we turn 14, we go to see the stars. I've been waiting ever so long. Dear sister, you're finally here. No time to waste. Let's see the stars.
Alright, had to get that out of the way. Everyone who doesn't complete this quest on every playthrough, including their first, is a heartless bastard and doesn't deserve any of my attention. Moving on to Castle Sol, which everyone remembers for the nice mausoleum next door. At the top of this castle, we meet Commander Neo. Now he might be a commander and he does summon 2 spirits when you enter the fight, but considering he barely attacks you during that and you can just quickly kill them, and then he basically doesn't summon them for the rest of the fight, the commander bit on his name can largely be forgotten. It's really a one-on-one fight. The first time I got to this boss I actually loved it, but I got to this boss fairly late and was a bit over-leveled, so I got through it fairly quickly. When I actually had to fight him again in my other playthroughs and actually learn him, the cracks in this fight did start to show. Now he has some great and flashy attacks that feel really good to dodge. However, with the Frost Wind, the fight discourages you from staying close to him while fighting him, so you move away. And then he has like 4 attacks you need to worry about. He has a lightning attack that has an absurd range and isn't really telegraphed that it has that range. He has 2 normal charges and then he has a long wind-up charge, after which he just stands there and takes some hits. So in the end the entire fight kind of boils down to those 4 attacks. Which in my opinion this late in the game gets repetitive quite quickly and is not enough for a boss fight. All the attacks work well, but you really needed more variety. Well, turns out Moke the Omen was only the beginning. What the fuck is this? This is pure insanity. Alright, let's collect ourselves here. Moke, Lord of Blood, is an absolutely fantastic boss. Not only is the arena fucking stunning, the visuals in this fight generally are really overwhelmingly good. But this one is fully fleshed out. Now you might say in the first phase most of the stuff is the same compared to Moke the Omen, which yes, but he also has one of the top 3 most memorable voice lines in the entire game, together with obviously Rykard and the Prawn Merchant.
Marika's tits. You must be hungry.
But phase 2 is where the fight becomes pure insanity, and that's the only way I got to describe this. This boss feels more like Satan than any actual Satan bosses in any other game. He crashes down upon you with black wings and a giant fucking glowing trident. There's bloodfire and explosions fucking everywhere. It's difficult to tell what's going on at times, but not in a bad way, in the sense that you're just completely overwhelmed. The only negatives I can really point towards here are that I actually think the second phase should have more of the health pool. I know he heals a bunch when he goes into it, but you can still kind of rush it down, which is what I managed to do the first time I played him, and I didn't really learn him at the time. I also think it's quite stupid that you can just skip his second phase if you have the right build and do enough damage. But honestly, this is critique on a high level. These are fairly minor gripes to what is an amazing boss. The Harlech tree is one of the most hidden areas FromSoft have ever included in any of their games. And the first boss you encounter is Loretta again? I mean, sure, she was fairly unique considering there aren't many horse riding bosses in the game, but Loretta again? So this is way later in the game, so what does she have to offer different this time? She gets some mildly upgraded attack at 50% HP, and that's about it. Oh, so just about nothing. Do I need to say more? I will say the lore and the setting for this fight is great, but does that save a reuse like that? I was harsh on Dark Souls 2 with their reuses, and so I have to be here too. This is not a successful reuse of a boss. Honestly, I don't think I need to introduce this next boss. I think she can do that herself. So, we finally arrived at Malenia. And let's just talk about the elephant in the room first. Let's just get it out of the way so it's done. The waterfall dance is probably the hardest to dodge attack in the entirety of Elden Ring. Maybe in the entirety of all the games I'm covering in this video. However, it is not undodgeable. Not by a long shot. There are plenty of ways to avoid it. You don't even need to be particularly good for some of them. You could just use Bloodhound Step that directly counters that attack. Even with a Bloodhound Step, as long as you don't play stupidly, just running backwards most of the time will get you out of the range of the first flurry, and then you just have to dodge the rest, which is much easier. And if you're really good, you can redirect her, which feels superbly amazing when you actually manage to pull it off cleanly. So I fully disagree with the notion that the waterfall dance ruins this fight. While it no doubt is a super hard to dodge attack, there are multiple options to do it, and when you actually manage to do it cleanly, it feels amazing. So it definitely has its place in the fight. Now, with that out of the way, we can finally talk about the rest of the fight, which I think it's sad that whenever you talk about Malenia, all anyone talks about really is the waterfall dance, because the rest of the fight is fucking incredible. This is one of maybe the best flowing base boss movesets ever. It's like a dance back and forth, where you have to know when you can get an attack in that will make a recoil and give you time, and when you can't. And then you have to dodge her flurry of attacks. It's amazing. It flows supremely well, it's fast, it's aggressive. I love everything about it. And there's no way in hell I can rate this boss that low, because the first time I fought this boss, it took me 18 hours to beat it. Now, granted, I will make some concessions here. I did some stupid things for like the first 14 hours, such as I refused to put on any clothes and so on. There were a bunch of things that after like 14 hours I said, okay, let's actually try to beat this boss and not just fuck around. But honestly, I enjoyed all these 14 hours. I wouldn't have gone for 14 hours with basically no end in sight to beating this boss if I didn't enjoy it. I wanted to beat the boss that way. Eventually I gave up and made some concessions, but I don't regret it in the slightest. So I think the first phase of this boss can compete with any boss phase out there. I truly believe that. Now let's actually talk about some negatives with this boss. The biggest one for me is her healing mechanic. Now, I don't hate it. I don't hate the idea behind it. However, I think the execution could have been better. Clearly this is based on a rune that you get after you beat her. However, her healing mechanic doesn't work like that rune, and I think in general the fight would have been better if her healing only applied in the certain time frame after you did the damage to her. Now we can talk about how long that time frame should be, that's all an open discussion, but I think that would have been a better option. This is one of the best bosses ever in my opinion. You can fight me over it, but I will stand by it. No boss that I enjoyed fighting for 18 hours straight, pretty much. Well, I slept in the middle, but still, point stands. Any boss that I fought for that long, I have to rate pretty damn high. Now people have very strong opinions about this boss, and there's a ton to talk about with her. For example, I didn't get to touch on the animation cancelling or the hyper armor, which works differently for her. And that's just two things I didn't get to touch on. However, explaining my viewpoint on these issues would take its entire own video, so I'm gonna leave that out here. All I'm gonna add to that is that some of these issues I agree with, some I don't, some I actually think improve the fight. But again, all that's an entirely different discussion. What I do want to say is that I hate how toxic the discussion around Malenia has become, where the side that likes her says in classic Souls fashion that anyone who doesn't like her just needs to get good, and the side that doesn't like her constantly says that the people who like her are just defending bad game design. I've rarely actually seen a proper discussion on Malenia from people with different viewpoints, so I just wanna say, whatever your opinion on the bosses, don't just dismiss the other side outright and actually try to have a discussion and understand why you came to a different conclusion than them. It might actually give you some new insight. In addition, while these 18 hours might seem intimidating, I wouldn't take them at face value, because for large parts of it, I was doing some stupid shit that really made the fight take a lot longer than it should have. And in my playthroughs for this video, often of course actually took me longer than Malenia. So while she is an outlier in terms of difficulty, she isn't an unprecedented outlier in terms of difficulty. In addition, I love it when games do shit like this. I played a lot of platformer games, and typically these games in quote-unquote end pretty early on. Take Celeste for example. You only have to beat the first 7 chapters until you arrive at the ending. You don't have to do any of the B-sides and so on, and the additional chapters. It took me less than 10 hours to quote-unquote beat Celeste. I have over 60 hours in the game. I see Malenia similarly to the very last bit of optional content in these platformer games. She's completely optional, she's in fact hidden away behind like 5 steps to even get to her. And the only reward you really get for beating her is that you can avoid a bad ending when you made some bad choices beforehand. But all the endings are accessible without fighting her. My opinion has always been, with this optional side content, go as far as you want. Make it as difficult as you want, make it as crazy as you want. It's optional, hidden side content. Nobody has to do it, there should be no limits to creativity and what you want to do as a developer. And the result of that is things like Malenia. Really fucking amazing bosses. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. When it comes to fights on horseback, the only bosses that really fulfill that role are the dragons. These are all optional side bosses. The only real main story boss where you use your horse is the fire giant. Now for one, this guy does deserve his name. He uses fire and he's certainly a giant. And the fight can feel epic because of that. He can destroy the landscape, he rolls around, he's very mobile. And he uses his size really to his advantage in some of the moves he does. The fight has some great visuals and can have some really fucking great moments. However, there are some issues with it, especially if you're a melee player. What you end up doing most of the time is just hack away at his feet in the first phase, and there you don't really get to see what's actually going on with him. Hitting his feet can also be awkward at times. So then in the second phase, after a really sick cutscene, where I didn't realize until that cutscene that he has a nose on his chest, by the way. Maybe I need to go and see a doctor about that. But there he drops into his knee so you can get a better view of what's actually going on and some of the visuals in the fight, which are, like I said, quite good. However, the balance in that second phase is just wrong. Honestly, it's easier to just ignore the weak spot on his hands and just go behind him and hack away at his feet. It takes a while, but it's way easier than actually fighting him the way you're kind of supposed to fight him and the way that is more fun. So in the end, while I don't think it would have ever been one of the best fights, it could have been quite a great fight, but some of the balancing really worked against that. We already talked about the Godskin Noble, and I said that I quite like him. I actually like the Godskin Apostle even more. But just because I like letting out a big dump and I like eating good food does not mean I want that big dump on my good food. What the fuck is this? This is just a mindless, maybe we need a boss here, so let's take these two bosses, put them together, make them respawn each other and as a duo boss, make no adjustments to them to make them work as a duo boss in the first place. Just put them there, it'll be fine, it's endgame. Fuck everything about that! Everything! This does not work in the slightest. So for one, the pillars can actually be destroyed. So the one cover you have can just be gone pretty much instantly. Take it from the Onsen and Smo fight where you had to use the pillars to separate them. Here that doesn't really work. I mean, they do kind of awkwardly walk around the destroyed pillars, which looks stupid by the way, but they can just do a lot of their attacks over them. And that's not even the worst of it, because the Godskin Noble can just do his attacks through them, which is lovely. I love everything about that. And the respawn mechanic, all that does is make you only focus on the one that's easier for you. For me, that was the Godskin Apostle. So the entire fight boiled down to waiting for them to separate, only attacking the Godskin Apostle, then waiting until it respawns and attacking the Godskin Apostle again. Fuck just everything about this fight. Nothing works. These are not two enemies that belong together. Dragonlord plus Sidious Axe is proof that the Dark Souls 2 team worked on Elden Ring 2. In fairness, this is the only boss run in the game that makes me want to throw myself off a cliff, so we've definitely made progress with the stakes of America here. And this is a pretty neat boss. They played around with the teleporting here, making it a big boss instead of a small one in the case of the Twin Princes, which makes it a bit more imposing when he suddenly appears in front of you. However, for me, when he doesn't do that, he's very static. He barely does anything. His breath is so slow, the only real danger you have during these moments is from the lightning that appears in areas, which is, in my opinion, not as interesting of a mechanic as the one with Vorticex. And so while this fight does have some really great moments, I wish it was a lot more mobile and dynamic at times. Malekith the Black Blade is a fucking fantastic boss. He is one of the rare beast bosses in Elden Ring. When you think about it, there really aren't that many. I mean, you have stuff like the Rune Bear, but that doesn't really count as a boss, let's be real. So in the context of the entire game, this one actually kind of fills a niche. And in addition, he's just very flashy and very fun to fight. He is also one of the very few bosses that make use of a part of the arena that isn't completely flat. It's really cool when it just jumps up on a pillar and swoops down on you with some really flashy attack. However, what does feel off in this fight is the balancing. His attacks that drain your HP gradually, plus remove some of their max HP, can just kill you in one hit, even if your vigor is pretty high. Add to that fact that he himself doesn't have much health either in his second phase, so it's a really weird fight balance wise. And I've already hinted at it, this is only the second phase of a two-part boss fight. The first phase is the Beast Clergyman, and I'm gonna be honest, I don't like the Beast Clergyman. Sure, he's set up well throughout the game, you meet him before and all that, but as a boss he's just not fun to fight. He's not particularly difficult, but his main danger comes from his quick melee attack, which feels like it's barely telegraphed, and when that is the main danger, that's not a good sign. Honestly, in my opinion, remove the first phase, make the second phase his full HP, and at least remove the gradual HP decrease or the max HP decrease. One of the two can stay, the other one has to go, and you have a fucking S-tier fight. Like this, however, it's not quite there.
And Sir Gideon Othmere, the all-knowing,
is a bitch. I'm gonna be honest, I'll be surprised if anyone remembers this boss fondly. There are usually only two experiences with Sir Gideon Othmere. Either you absolutely curb-stomped him to death before he could even finish his monologue, or you played a strength build with a fairly slow weapon and could barely get any hits in because he doesn't have openings long enough for you to get some in without getting hit, so you have to trade hits, and then he's a total bitch. And I've experienced both. In my first playthrough I absolutely curb-stomped him, and my second he took me like half an hour because fucking hell you can't get any hits in cleanly. You really barely can. It's fucking frustrating to fight. While the idea behind him is cool with he gets the attacks of the bosses you beat, the execution is fucking terrible. Like I said, if you're a fast build, you'll likely barely remember this guy. However, if you're a strength build, he keeps spamming attacks at a rate that is inhuman. You're basically fighting an NPC with infinite stamina, infinite mana, and a fuckload of spells. It's not fun. One possible experience leaves you disappointed and wanting more, and the other one leaves you wanting it does not exist. This is a trash boss. Get him out of here. The other boss in Leyndell that felt like it was destined to be more was Godfrey the First Elden Lord, or as I'm gonna call it from now on, the Golden Shade. Here we see the real Godfrey the First Elden Lord, and he's a marked improvement from that. His moveset is more fleshed out, and he also feels more aggressive and uses his combos more, though that last point might just be my imagination, but it felt like that when I played him. And additionally, and this is the big one, he does not look like shit. For the Golden Shade, what was there in terms of gameplay wasn't bad, so you didn't have to switch it up completely. These small touches already elevated it a lot. But don't let this first phase distract you from the fact that in 2022, Horalu threw Jeff off Hell in a Cell and plummeted 16 feet through the platform in front of the Erdtree. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the second phase where he goes full on WWE style. What the fuck is going on? The first time I saw this, I was just in awe. I mean, can you be anything else when you see this? I couldn't be mad. This is fucking amazing. He just threw away his axe and started wrestling. I love every part of it. This fight feels surprisingly lighthearted. For one of the last fights of the game and a fight against the first Elden Lord, his dialogue, his honestly pretty funny moveset in his second phase give the fight a really interesting feel. And I love it. Not only do I love the feeling of the second phase, the gameplay is also fucking great. There's really not many bad things I can say about this boss. I love it. We've arrived at the end. It's been a journey, not just in-game but honestly also in this video. But there's 2 more left to go and I'm gonna talk about them separately because they are very different from each other. The first phase of the final boss is Radagon of the Golden Order. And this fight does feel like the beginning of the end. I mean, come on, we have the theme soundtrack playing. That's a direct sign. And while this guy actually isn't the father of Morgoth, aka Margit, you would think so, because my god, they put delays in his delays. He delays attacks so much that he just defies gravity for a second to delay his attack while in the air. This is the ridiculous point we've reached in terms of the delays in this game. This feels like the mechanic finale of the game, because the moveset of him actually feels kind of basic, but everything has something added, either an explosion or an after effect, something additional to one-up it. And this is another one where if you're in the flow, the fight flows actually pretty great. However, there's one thing I absolutely hate about this fight, and that's his teleport. The teleport itself is fine, but the fact that you can get hit by it, aka it does damage, aka it staggers you for a second, sucks. Because the teleport is often so fast that you can barely react to it, and even though it does no damage, it often keeps you staggered long enough that an actual attack from him can hit you. However, apart from that, it's a great mechanical finale. It's not too hard, it's not too easy, and by this point you really have to have learned the game to beat him. But he does not feel like the end, he only feels like the beginning of the end, and that's because he isn't the end. In an almost complete departure from the art style even that was used throughout the rest of the game, the final boss is this thing, the Elden Beast. And a lot of people seem to hate the fact that it looks so different. I think it's perfect. This is the final boss. This is something from outer cosmos. This is something out of this world. This is something majestic. The atmosphere and the environment reflects that perfectly. It looks amazing, and this is one of the few times where the soundtrack in Elden Ring really shines. The closest thing you can compare this boss to is to a dragon boss, which is fitting for a final boss. You just had a one-on-one mechanical finale with a humanoid boss, so now you have the opposite. He uses long attacks, he moves around a lot, and he's fucking huge. His moveset is incredibly varied, from star-like attacks like Astel, to a ring attack that you have to jump over, which is really unique, to attacks like the Divine Dragon from Sekiro. Attacks where you have to run perpendicular, attacks where you have to run away, attacks where you have to dodge, attacks where you have to jump. It's very varied, but it's kept in a way as a follow-up boss. All these attacks are easily dodgeable on the first try. Even without having seen the attacks before, you can clearly tell what you need to do. That is, as long as you're able to lock off the Elden Beast from time to time when it's necessary to look at your surroundings. The general complaint I see with this boss is that it runs away too much. A lot of his attacks though, where he quote-unquote runs away, he comes straight back. And for a bunch of other attacks you can just straight up predict where he's gonna be afterwards. For example, when he does the ring attack, just run to the opposite side of the arena. It's not that complicated. He really doesn't run away more than Placiduous X. And anyway, this is the final boss. I want him to make use of the space and feel like an epic, grandiose fight. However, there's one attack which is actually bullshit. I am talking about the Elden Stars attack. There are actually two variants of this attack. One he seems to do before he gets to a certain health point and one he seems to do after. At least that's what I think is the case. I'm not 100% sure, but that feels like it. The first variant, which he does at higher HP, you can just run away from. This one's perfectly fine. The second one is so fast that you can't do that. And with that second one, you will always take some chip damage. Pretty much always. So fuck that second variant. But enough of that one. Forget that attack. Everything else flows wonderfully. You can have moments where he does 2 attacks at a time pretty much, and it feels great to dodge both of them at the same time. That's something barely any other boss has managed to do ever in the FromSoft catalog. When you finally beat him and get that God slain message, boy does it feel fucking good. So after that, there's only one thing left to do. Activate the best ending. And with best ending, I obviously mean a Frenzied Flame ending, but before you get the Frenzied Flame, Melina sacrificed herself, so she's not even there to stop you destroying the entire world. No one's there to deliver you your destined death. Saved another world from the eternal agony of existing. Let's fucking go. Elden Ring is not perfect in terms of bosses. The bosses here are the least representative of the actual full game out of any of the games presented here, because there are so many more bosses in the game than I got to talk about. However, despite that, I would argue that Elden Ring is still incredibly successful in the bosses, because that's not the focus of the game. There are so many things about this game that I think it does better than its bosses. Like the base combat system being fucking incredible, like the world being absolutely amazing, exploration feeling as good as it ever has been in a video game. Bosses still being damn good despite not being the focus is just a cherry on top. And yes, they have issues. Some I've talked about, some I didn't get to talk about. We can talk about all the rehashes it does, whether it's too many or whether it's fine for a game as long as that to have this many rehashes. But that's a whole different discussion. I think Elden Ring is absolutely incredible with its bosses, and it deserves a lot of praise for what it did. And with that, we're done. It's been a journey. I started making this video around February 2022 and now it's October. It ended up being a lot more work than I anticipated, and the result I got I'm still not entirely happy with. I mean, a lot of the footage is mine and I wish I could redo some of what I said about some bosses, but if I go down that route, I'm never gonna get done with this. Just to give you an idea about how many stages this took, originally I laid down some ideas for bosses that I might want to incorporate in the video. Then I wrote down with these ideas a script which incorporated some new things. I left out some things that I thought isn't gonna work, and then at some point before even starting editing I recorded all 180 plus voice lines. While recording those I changed a lot of the script, I threw in some new ideas, I left out some I thought weren't gonna work anymore. So then I had a set of 182 voice lines. Of this set of voice lines, around 20 made it into the video, the rest I redid. And that's just the voice lines, that's not even the bulk of the work. Now I'm not trying to build this video up to be some amazing masterpiece. All I'm saying is, this is as good as it was ever gonna get, if it was gonna get finished at all. This is the end result and I'm sticking with it. I already wanna make some changes, I already wanna redo like half the video. But no, it's done. I need to move on, I need to do something else. I've been going insane over this, spending like 12 hours a day for weeks. And I do still go to university as well as work a bit on the side, so it's not like I have only free time. So yeah, I'm just happy it's done. To cap this off, if you wanted me to rank the games by how good the bosses are in them, it would look like this. And if you wanted me to rank the games by how good the games in total are, it would look like this. So just to be clear, the bosses aren't a full representation of the game as a whole. Now that it's done, I'm probably gonna go back to streaming more regularly on Twitch. You can follow me there if you want. I mean, come on, you watched to the end of this fucking video. And if I'm gonna do videos from now on, I think it's gonna be smaller ones than this. So with all that finally said, this is Jeff, and I'm out. Thanks for watching.